A Dark Redemption by Stav Sherez. Read by David Thorpe. Back then. They came more often now, the headaches. Raging storms within his skull, crippling pain, flashes of light. There was nothing to do but shut his eyes and lie back, let the pain and visions take over. Memories and flashbacks trailed the headaches. Jack would close his eyes and see blue sky, green jungle, red road. He would try to watch the trees outside his window divesting themselves of leaves, the slow spinning fall of September, but instead he saw the leaves of the jungle, leaves so big you could sit inside them and be wholly encased, leaves which vibrated and twitched and reacted to your presence as if sentient beings. They'd arrived in the middle of a heatwave. David buckled as he exited the plane, feet planted on the stairway, the sun leaching all colour and breath from his face. He stood there and took in the burned yellow country in front of him, then turned back into the plane as if the pilot had made a mistake. But Jack was right there, taking his arm, leading him back out into the light, whispering in his ear, "We're here." They deplaned onto the gleaming, cracked tarmac, the customs hall 500 feet away, shimmering like a mirage in the heat. The other passengers rushed past them, pushing, elbows out, as if they were a prize for the first to get to the hall. They walked as slowly as they could, savouring the air, the unfamiliar sky. Those first moments when you land in a new country and feel a sudden quickening, a snap charge rattling through your bones. Their friends were in India, Peru, Vietnam. They were sitting on beaches, cocktails in hand, watching the surf break against the sand, waiting for the night, the drugs, the screaming music, and torrential sex. "Everybody goes there," Jack had protested after David suggested a trip down the Ganges. "We'll be on a boat in the middle of nowhere and we'll bump into everyone we know." It had been the afternoon of their graduation. They still wore the robes and mortars, still wore the smiles they'd flashed for the cameras, degrees in hand, or parents held close, each trying to outgrin the other. Now the parents were gone, the degrees stuffed into a desk somewhere, the beer and cigarettes flowing. "Jack's right," Ben replied, sipping a pint, his fingers playing with an unlit cigarette. Unlike Jack and David, Ben had worn a proper suit underneath the gown and now seemed out of place and out of age in this noisy student pub. "We might as well stay here as go to India." "Well, just because everyone goes there doesn't mean it's a bad idea." David slumped back into the booth, his hair draped like a shawl around his shoulders, the button-down shirt and drain-pipe jeans a strange contrast with those long black locks. "Doesn't mean it's a good one either," Ben replied as he spread out a map of the world in front of them. Jack moved the glasses away so they could have more room. "Uganda." He pointed to a bright orange square halfway up the map. "Cheap, safe, guaranteed sun, and no chance of bumping into anyone we know." They stared at it as if ensnared. The mass of multicoloured land that delineated the African continent, the regimented lines of borders, the names of countries they hadn't even known existed until they saw them printed on the map. That was all the decision there was to it. David, as usual, acquiesced. That they would be together was more important than where they went. They all knew this would be the last time. Summer was approaching fast, and then would come autumn and jobs and careers and the beginning of something, the end of something else. They went through customs without a hitch. They caught a cab and threaded through sunburned fields, the driver speaking English so fast and fractured he sounded like a man drowning. They nodded their heads, mustered an appropriate "yeah" every now and then, but their faces were turned away, staring through the grimy windows, watching the plains of East Africa roll by, a landscape of tall grasses and spindly trees, skeletal cattle and dark, beckoning mountains punctuating the distant horizon. Jack rubbed his head and stared out into the London night, remembering the tumult of sense and smell and noise as they entered Kampala. His headache began to recede as he let the memories flicker and spin. He remembered David exiting the taxi, bending down and vomiting in the street, his skin pallid as a corpse. Jack had crossed over to a stall, kids instantly surrounding him, their little hands waving and clutching cheap plastic objects he couldn't make sense of, old boxes of matches and photocopied pictures of Michael Jackson. He bought 3 warm Cokes and came back to find Ben handing out crumpled banknotes to the bright-eyed and smiling children. They sat on their backpacks and drank the Coke, warm and sickly sweet, and it was the best Coke they'd ever tasted. The kids delighted them, even though they could see beyond the smiles and welcomes to the grinding poverty which underlay their lives. There were always more kids, more hands outstretched. What they asked for was so little in English money that it seemed mean to deny them, but then you found all your time being taken by handing out money, and you forgot to look up at the buildings, the sky, the trees, the surly young men lounging on every street corner. They all went through it once. Tears, jags of self-pity, wanting desperately to go home. Even Ben, who'd travelled almost everywhere by the time he'd got to university. "Just good old culture shock," Jack quipped after Ben had come back from the hostel toilet, having found it overflowing, an army of cockroaches big as baby shoes swarming over the bowl. When they lay down on their pillows that evening, they could smell other men's nights, puke and booze and blood. "I think we should pick up the car and get out of here," Jack suggested on the 3rd day. They paid twice what they'd agreed for the car back home, but it was still cheap. They still thought in English money, and though the car, an old white Honda Civic, looked like it would fall apart at the first kick of the engine, it managed to glide effortlessly through the cracked and teeming streets of the capital. They took the Masaka-Kampala road west out of the city. In less than 10 minutes, the concrete gave way to flat pastureland, dry and cracked, small villages everywhere, circular patterns of daub and wattle huts just visible on the side of the highway. The road was empty, apart from army vehicles blazing down the fast lane, young soldiers bumping along in the beds of open-backed trucks, their eyes lazily drifting to the 3 white boys and then back to their cigarettes. They made a detour down to the shores of Lake Victoria and ate fruit and crackers as the sun flashed along the calm surface of the water, and Ben explained the history and naming of the lake, the great foolish Victorians with their hats and pomp and retinue of carriers and servants. Jack suggested they head for Murchison Falls National Park, the name a siren song to him, its grandiloquence and archaic quality like something out of a Sherlock Holmes novel. "We could just stay in Masaka and check out the ruins Oris." Ben was consulting their second-hand guidebook. "What's so special about Murchison Falls?" "I love the way it sounds," Jack replied, seduced as always by the poetry of place names, the worlds conjured up by phonetic accident. "That's why you want to go there?" David had the gift of always sounding flabbergasted, surprised at the world in all its variants, an antidote to their measured and unearned cynicism. The waters of Lake Victoria glowed like polished glass. "Forget the guidebook," Jack replied, staring out towards the dark-shadowed rim of the horizon. "Let's just start driving." Ben and David exchanged a glance that reflected years of growing up together, sharing hidden jokes, conspiring against parents, and agreed. But Ben kept the guidebook safely in his bag, just in case. They backtracked and took the highway north, watching the land change. The fields and crops and empty plains gave way to more rugged terrain. Mountains loomed out of the sky and disappeared. The road deteriorated until it was only a narrow lane. The heat became worse, not just sun striking the roof of the car, but a deeper, denser heat, a humidity they'd never experienced before. A rottenness in the air that crept into your bones and brain, making your eyes water and the breath die in your throat. Sweet potato and maize fields stretched out either side of them, dry and willowy in the early evening heat haze. Termite mounds stood 10 feet tall, skyscrapers among the corn stalks and grasses, like totem poles from another race, the tenements of a forgotten people. The town of Masindi appeared out of nowhere. One minute they were driving the dirt road, yellow fields bordering them on both sides, and the next they were on a dusty, corrugated street with white single-storey buildings, women carrying baskets on their heads, kids and more kids, the whole African movie trailer cliché right before their eyes. They stopped for beer and food at a tiny stall still bearing the name of the Asian proprietor who had established it before being expelled by Idi Amin in 1972. The old man, the new owner, served them warm Niles, the slogan, "The true reward of progress," making David chuckle as he swigged the sweet beer. They watched cars go by, leaving trails of dust in the air. Far-off volcanoes shimmered on the horizon like things unsubstantial and contingent. Children came and held their palms out, smiled and laughed and danced on the spot as Ben handed them money. They sat in the rear of the cafe, washing the dust and heat from their bodies, glad for the stillness after 8 hours of bad road. Murchison wasn't far, another few hours' drive north. They'd stay in Masindi for the night, it was decided, and head there tomorrow. I still can't believe it. David was sitting under a palm tree, peeling the label off a bottle of Nile. Being here, I mean. Remember how much we talked about it? Ben leant forward, spilling ash over the table. It had been their only topic of discussion these last few months, cramming for exams, finishing their dissertations, the horizon of the holiday, the one bright thing to look forward to, the question of where to go burning in their minds. David finished off his beer. The three of us here, together. He paused so they could all savour this. A shadow briefly crossed his face. He stared at the thin, tapering road. Who knows where we'll be this time next year? I think Jack's got a pretty good idea. Ben smiled, his teeth shining white in the sun. Jack looked off into the distance, the volcanoes smoky and out of focus, like cheap back projections in a pre-war movie. I wish I did, he replied, thinking back to the day 3 weeks ago when he'd broken the news. At first he'd wanted to keep it secret, alternately proud and a little ashamed of his good luck, the way you always are with close friends. But they'd got drunk one evening, another in a long line of housemates' birthday parties, and he told them about the deal. 3 albums, a decent amount of money, a cool London-based record label. I wish it felt real. I wish it felt like something I could celebrate, but I keep thinking I'll come back and find a letter apologising for the mistake they've made. Jack focused on the table, the empty green bottles like soldiers standing silent sentry. Ben clapped him on the back, gave him one of those Ben smiles they all knew. The smile that had got them girls, entry to parties, whatever they desired. Nonsense, too late for that, it's coming out next month. September, Jack corrected him, his legs shivering despite the humidity. Only a couple of months to go until the album was in the shops, on the radio. It felt too surreal, too weird to accept as fact. It had been only a dream for so long that its reality seemed conjured from nothing but wish and desire. He'd made the album just like he'd made the ones which preceded it, in his room on a 4-track. He'd laid down the guitars, vocals and drum machine himself. He'd sent it out like he'd sent the countless tapes before, but this time the record company had got back to him. a man with a silly accent raving and ranting about how Jack was going to be the next big thing. He'd travelled down to London, signed the deal in a Soho restaurant, and was back in Manchester in time to finish his exams. "To top of the pops!" David held his bottle up. Jack and Ben crashed theirs against it, the clink and scrape amplified in the still air. Yeah, as if. Jack finished off his beer. He got up and went to get the next round. He thought about his songs on the radio, tentacles reaching out of the speakers and into the ears of listeners. And then he shut the thought down, knowing the dangers that lurked in daydreams. It was just a small release on a tiny label, nothing to get excited about. The first rung of many. Still, as he took the beers, the cool glass sweet against his palms, he couldn't help but feel that things were coming together for the first time, that his life was at last taking some kind of shape, and that he was here doing exactly what he wanted to be doing with exactly the two people he wanted to be doing it with. He noticed that something had changed when he came back out with the drinks. Ben and David were sitting silently, their eyes fixed on the opposite side of the road. He sat next to them, doled out the beers, was about to say something when Ben's expression stopped him, made him look across the street. Two policemen were leaning over something. They were tall, young, dressed in dark blue. They held black sticks in their hands, like truncheons but longer and skinnier. Jack squinted, trying to focus through the heat haze, and noticed the heap of clothes lying on the ground between them. He watched as the heap moved, gradually revealing a face, eyes, hair. The soldiers swung in long, deliberate arcs. The crunch of truncheon against bone echoed all the way across to where they sat, a thick, heavy stuttering splitting the air. They watched silently as the policeman started kicking the man, passing around a bottle of clear liquid, wiping their mouths, then wiping the blood from their shoes on the crumpled man's clothes. "No!" Ben grabbed David the moment he stood up, held him firmly by the arm. "It's not our business." David swayed and shuddered in his grip. The soldiers had regained their momentum and were swinging on the man as if breaking rocks. Jack shook his head. "Sit down before they notice us." David pulled away. "They're going to kill him," he said, his voice pinched. "Of course it's our business." "David!" A thin line of sweat broke out on Ben's forehead, and his voice caught in the sticky air. Jack sat and watched the soldiers beat the man. His legs felt like they were on fire, as though the only thing that would make them better would be to get up, cross the road and stop this terrible thing. But he couldn't move. The heat and dread sealed him to the spot. With every blow, he felt something inside him rip. He gripped the rough, splintered edges of the chair until he felt a warm trickle of blood covering his fingers. Suddenly, the policeman stopped, noticing their audience for the first time. They turned towards the three white boys drinking at the bar and started clapping their hands, as if they were the ones watching and not the other way round. Jack stood up. "No!" Ben was almost shouting. "What the fuck do you think will happen to us if we interfere?" Jack looked at David, saw his own thoughts and fears wheeling through his friend's eyes, the space between them, the time it would take to cross the road. He sat down. Christ! He ground his feet into the dirt below him, beetles cracking like eggshells under his heels. David stood for a few seconds staring at the policeman, then shook his head and sat down too. They opened their beers and drank them without saying anything. The policeman eventually stopped and walked off. A woman came and knelt by the bleeding man, crying and shouting at the empty road. They finished their beers and headed upstairs to their rooms. The next day, they drove across dusty dirt roads, bumpy and bone-rattling, the tall weeds bordering them on both sides, trees rising out of the sea of grass like the masts of sinking ships. The land was flat, the mountains always shimmering on the horizon. Their heads raged with pain, last night's beer barrelling through their skulls. Trucks laden with people and clusters of jerry cans passed them every hour or so, men and women strapped to the roofs like wayward luggage. The passengers waved, and they waved weakly back, smiling though the locals weren't. Every now and then an army truck screamed by, laden with scowling soldiers, whipping up dust and rocks, heading north. They passed small villages, all identical, a circle of mud huts by a stream and nothing more. They ate peanuts and crackers and cheese squeezed out of a tube like toothpaste. The sun sank somewhere in the west, blazing the mountains red like a caul stretched over the rim of the world. The landscape began to close its arms around them. They found themselves climbing through high valleys and twisting ravines, the jungle almost imperceptible in its embrace until, all at once, they noticed it was there, right above and to all sides of them, and they couldn't remember how the land had changed so quickly or when. They passed a village of burning huts just before the light finally died. Thick black plumes of smoke emerging like serpents from their roofs, an eerie stillness in the air. They drove a little faster and didn't say a word to one another. Dark came suddenly, not like back home with its languorous twilight, but like a switch being flicked. 1 minute they could see the mountains and fields, the next only the tunnel of white illuminated by the car's headlights, as if they were carving out the road from the darkness itself. They stopped at a place where the road widened and switched on the in-car light, spreading the map out across elbows and knees. "We won't make it," Jack said, looking at the multicoloured squiggles, the distance they still had to cover before reaching the park. David sighed, turning his face away. "What's up with you?" Jack snapped, the tension of the day making itself felt in his voice. "I just wish you'd stop being so negative just for once." Jack stared out into the night. "You want to try driving another 6 hours in this?" He felt bad as soon as he said it and saw the hurt look on David's face. "What are our options?" Ben asked, diplomatic as ever, though Jack could sense a tremor of unease in his voice. "We can camp here," Jack replied, looking around at the dark bush, then back down at the map. He lit a cigarette and traced the small lines like capillaries branching out from the main road. "Or there's what looks like a shortcut." He pointed to a thin ribbon of red that veered out towards the left. "We passed the turnoff about 15 minutes ago." Ben stared at the dark bush surrounding the car, the rustling of the grasses like old women whispering to each other, the scary smear of galaxies above. "Fuck camping out here." They backtracked and found the turning. There were no signs marking which direction the road headed or even what its name was, and they had to take it on faith and an old map that this was indeed the Django Road. They drove slowly over the dark surface of the land. The grasses hissed in the wind, a flickering chatter that made them roll up their windows. "It sounds so human," David said, his face pressed up against the glass. Ben looked at him strangely, then turned back to the road and braked suddenly, the car's wheels spinning out from under him. Jack flew forward, arms crashing hard against the dash. Ahead of them, the road forked. There were no signs, and each branch seemed of equal width, both disappearing into blackness at the edge of the headlight's domain. "Shit!" Ben said, pulling out the map, spreading it on his knees, his hands shaking. "There's no fork marked on the fucking map." "Africa," David replied with a sigh. It had become their code word for anything that defied logic, that did the opposite of what it said it did. Jack unbuckled his seatbelt and got out of the car, the ground crunching and squirming under his feet like something living. He walked up to the fork, trying to see whether one side was more used than the other, looking for telltale tyre tracks, but there was nothing to distinguish between them. Something flickered across his vision. An antelope? Gazelle? And just as quickly disappeared, bounding up the left fork, its white hoofs illuminated by their headlights. He stared into the black distance where both roads disappeared, then walked back to the car. "There's nothing to tell them apart. We'll have to guess." David looked at him, his eyes sagging with sleep and frustration. "Oh, you like the way it sounded? Shit, you choose." Jack stared at the place where the road divided, thinking left or right, trying to work out which direction they were facing, looking for a sign, a hunch, a spasm of intimation. But there were only the odds. 50-50. The others were waiting for him to make the choice. The hours on the road were weighing on them, and they just wanted to keep moving. He thought of the ghostly gazelle he saw, the small circle of hoofs flashing in the black night. "We're taking the left," he finally said, trying to sound authoritative. "You sure?" He turned to Ben about to answer, then saw that Ben was joking, and for a moment all the fear and nervousness was gone, and they were three friends in a car again, hurtling towards the next adventure. Ben turned the engine back on and shifted into first. The road felt crinkled and folded beneath them as if loath to let them go. They swung onto the left fork and disappeared into the night. They had driven for an hour on the fork when they saw the first flicker of the fires. Ben slowed the car instinctively, the wild, raging light making them blind to the darkness. When their eyes adjusted, they saw the roadblock. The logs stretched across the dirt track, the blazing fires cracking wildly in the breeze, and then they saw the eyes of the soldiers glaring at them, guns drawn and pointed. Ben brought the car to a stop, and they began to make out voices barking orders, shouting "Get out!" shouting "Mzungu!" The soldiers' guns flickering in the firelight, the black barrels staring at them like the gouged-out eyes of some implacable god. Part 1. London 2012. Chapter 1. The coffee machine wasn't working. It burbled, hissed and spluttered to a stop. Jack Carrigan stared at it in disbelief. He'd bought it only 3 months ago, and it was supposed to last a lifetime. He turned it on and off, jiggled and gently shook it, and when that didn't work, he hit it twice with the side of his fist. The machine coughed, hummed, and then, miraculously, started pouring what looked like a passable cup of espresso. The sound of the coffee slowly oozing through the steel and silver pipes always made him feel better. He began to notice the morning, the thin streamers of sunlight leaking through the gap in the curtains he'd never got round to fixing. The sound of cars being put through their morning shuffles, coughs of cold engine and shriek of gears, the doors of houses closing, the patter of tiny feet on the pavement, the clatter of human voices arising from the early morning air. The machine groaned once and stopped. He reached for the cup, the smell making his mouth tingle, and was just about to take his first sip when the phone rang. London came back with a rush of clanging decibels. His left ear began its metronomic buzzing. He staggered over to the table, his fingers brushing lightly over Louise's photo, picked up the receiver and held his breath. Carrigan walked through the park, trying to shake off the previous night. He'd arrived back from the coast late, scraped the mud from David's grave off his shoes, and fell heavily onto the sofa, where he had awoken crumpled and cramped this morning. It had been a last-minute decision. He'd be down there with Ben in a couple of weeks, but something yesterday had called him, a pulse beating behind his blood. He spent a few minutes staring at the trees, soaking in the heat, trying to ignore what lay waiting for him on the other side of the fence. Late September in Hyde Park was his favourite season, the grass still scorched by summer's sun, the trees heavy, the first leaves fluttering down to the waiting ground. He closed his eyes, and Louise's face rose out of the dark. This park her favourite place, holding hands in snowstorms, watching kids playing by the pond, both of them thinking this life would last forever. Carrigan exited the park and walked on the road to avoid the clots of tourists emerging from Queensway Station. He watched them huddling in tight packs, wearing the same clothes, staring up at the same things. He envied them their innocence, seeing London for the first time, a city with such history, yet without personal ghosts. When you'd lived here all your life, you stopped seeing the city and saw only the footsteps you'd carved through it. A palimpsest traced in alleyways and shop windows, bus stations and bends of the river. He reached the building and looked around for D.S. Carlson, whose call had interrupted his morning coffee, but he was nowhere to be seen. He took out his phone and made sure he had the right address. 2 PCs had been called to a flat in King's Court earlier. When they saw what they were dealing with, they immediately called in CID. Carrigan looked up at the towering facade and pressed the porter's buzzer. He knew the building well. They received a call every week about something, mainly waste-of-time stuff, noise complaints, funny smells, burglar alarms going off for no explicable reason in the middle of the night. But, like any building with over 500 residents, it had its share of domestic abuse, suicide, and small-time drug dealing. He tried the buzzer again. He could hear voices crackling faintly through the intercom, conversations in languages he didn't recognise, floating in and out of hearing, criss-crossing each other until they dissolved into static and white noise. A woman with a pram was wrestling the door from inside. Carrigan held it open for her and, as she thanked him, slipped past into the marbled lobby, its cool mirrored surfaces and swirling carpets making him feel instantly dizzy. He knocked on the door to the porter's booth, but there was no answer. He peered through the frosted glass, squinting his headache away, and saw the slumped shape of a man inside. This time he gave it his 4 a.m. police knock. When the door opened, the stink hit him like a fist. Body odour, cigarettes, and despair. The porter was a small, withered man with 3-day stubble and eyes that looked as if they never stopped crying. His face twitched intermittently, revealing dark gums and missing teeth as he struggled to pull himself back together. Jack knew exactly how he felt. "Detective Inspector Carrigan." He showed the man his warrant card, but the porter only nodded, not looking at it or at him, and shuffled back into his room, collapsing onto a chair whose stuffing poked out like mad Professor Hare. The porter's cubicle looked as if it had once been a luggage locker. There were no windows, no room for anything but a table, a chair, and 4 small TV monitors with a constantly running video feed of the building's entrance. The porter was breathing heavily, lost in the screen, watching the unpeopled doorway with such riveting poise it could have been the last minutes of a cup final he was witnessing. Carrigan shuffled a few steps forward, bending his head to avoid the low ceiling. He took small, shallow gulps of the stale air. "You keep spare keys to individual flats?" The porter barely acknowledged him, a faint turn of the head, nothing more. He eventually looked up from the screen and scratched his stubble. "Not no more. Used to be everyone left with me, but things change." He didn't elaborate how. "Flat 87's the one directly above 67, right?" The porter nodded. "I thought you guys were in 67. "We are," Carrigan replied tersely, wishing he'd had time to get breakfast. Do you have the keys for flat 87 or not? The porter opened a drawer and pulled out an old ledger. He rapidly flicked through the pages. Sweat poured down his face as he squinted at the shaky handwriting. He ran one yellowed finger down a list of numbers, then stopped. Flat 87. No spare. He zoned out in front of the screen again. Carrigan craned his neck, but there was only the image of the front door, fish-eyed, black and white, empty. He thanked the man, found out when his shift ended, and left the sweatbox of an office. He saw the two constables nervously chatting outside the door to 67. The look in their eyes told him this wasn't just a prank, something they could all laugh about on their way back to the station. He nodded, walked past them, and knocked on the door. He waited as a series of locks tumbled and unclenched until the door finally opened and an old woman stared at him as if she'd never seen a man before. It took him a few seconds to realise she was or had been a nun. The habit faded and worn, the crucifix dangling like a medallion from her thin, wattled neck. "I'm Detective Inspector Carrigan." He showed her his warrant card. The old nun didn't acknowledge, just turned and walked back into her flat. He was never surprised at how people lived, and yet he was always surprised. 15 years on the job, how many flats, houses, mansions had he been into? How many lives marked out by the geography of walls? He told all his young constables that the key to a person was in how they lived their lives. Study their surroundings, how they chose to arrange themselves in this world. You'll learn much more from that than from listening to them talk or staring deeply into their eyes. He walked through the small hallway and into the living room. The furniture was mismatched, as if collected over time from disparate sources. Chipped and cracked paint everywhere. Pieces of drawers and light fittings missing, replaced, if at all, by masking tape. The carpet was worn and thin, showing through to the floorboards. Stains described maps across the floor like countries never visited, dark and sticky spots where tea or ketchup or custard had landed. The old nun coughed, hacking into her hand. She lit a cigarette, the smell instantly filling the room. The mantelpiece and bookshelves held no books, only a staggering variety of porcelain dogs. Carrigan stepped closer and saw they were all West Highland Terriers, produced in a variety of finishes and styles. A few looked almost real, while others were the product of some kind of artistic myopia, resembling sheep or clouds more than they did dogs. But it was the two pieces at the far end of the mantelpiece he couldn't keep his eyes off. It was these two that the old lady was silently pointing to with the end of her cigarette. These dogs weren't white like the rest. They were red. A crimson caul covered their bodies. The old nun was gesturing at them, speechless, as if such a thing had no referent in language. Her eyes had receded deep into their sockets, and when she pulled on the cigarette, she looked like a Halloween skull. Carrigan inched forward. He looked at the dogs, and then he looked up. A patch of red in the shape of a teardrop was slowly spreading from one corner of the ceiling. The constables followed his gaze and, as they watched, a single red drop fell, exploding against the white mantelpiece like an exotic flower. Chapter 2. Carrigan walked up the stairs to the next landing, his heart sinking, his feet dragging behind him. He couldn't see where the hallway ended. The mangy carpet disappeared into a funnel of darkness a few flats down. It reminded him of those long nightmare corridors in The Shining, a film he wished he'd never seen, its images promiscuous and relentless long after the watching was over. The hallway was lit from above by twitching fluorescents recessed under a metal grille that rained down the light in black spears against the walls and carpet. The air seemed packed tighter here than on the floor below, filled with heavy, textured smells, the various scents commingling and forming new alliances in the corridor. All around buzzed the noise and hum of lives lived behind closed doors. Muffled announcers on blaring TV sets, broken conversations, pounding drum and bass. The rotten reek of cooked cabbage and garlic, arguments and shouting, a faint whiff of weed. He heard the two constables come up behind him, their faces pale with what they'd seen and what they were about to see. He stopped in front of number 87 and knocked. Two old ladies wrapped in thick muslin that made them look mummified walked past, their eyes lingering on Carrigan, unspoken suspicion in every muscle twitch. He ignored them, knocked once more, then got to his knees. There was no letterbox, but he could see a half-inch gap between the front door and the hallway's filthy carpet. He pressed his face against the floor, feeling the sticky shag pile grab at his beard, but he couldn't see any light coming from inside the flat. He moved, pressing his face closer, took a deep breath, and immediately started coughing. He took one more to be sure, then got up, brushed the dirt off his clothes, and called it in. He sent the constables back downstairs and waited for the soccos to arrive. He spent the time watching the flow of bodies in and out of flats, a constant shuffle of lives enacted in this dim and dank hallway. He knocked on adjacent doors. There was no answer from the flats either side of 87. He knocked on the flat directly opposite. The door opened, and an unshaven man with a cigarette that seemed moulded to his lips looked at Carrigan and said, "Huh?" Carrigan showed him his warrant card, asked if he knew who lived opposite. The man wouldn't make eye contact with him. Somewhere inside the flat, Carrigan heard a woman shouting in Greek, Romanian, he didn't know, the man's eyes narrowing as if each word were a splinter driven into his flesh. "No, police," he said. "I done nothing wrong." Carrigan wedged his foot in the door as the old man tried to close it. The old man looked up at him, a rabbity fear in his eyes. "I'm not interested in you." Carrigan pointed to the flat across the hall. "I want to know who lives there." The man looked down at his slippers, torn grey things exposing yellowed and cracked toenails. He shook his head, but the action seemed to be commenting on something bigger than Carrigan's question. "I see nothing, and I don't want to see nothing." This time Carrigan let him shut the door. People in these blocks never heard or saw anything. He knew that from experience. It wasn't that they had anything to hide, not like trying to canvass witnesses in a hostile estate, but in the countries they'd fled from, a knock on the door could mean imprisonment, torture, and often worse. How were they to know that police all over the world weren't the same? The Soccos and D.S. Carlson arrived a few minutes later. They suited up in the stairwell and gave Carrigan his oversuit, latex gloves and foot protectors. The starchy chemical smell filled his nostrils as he unsnapped the gloves and slipped them on. "Any idea what's in there?" Carlson was filling the sign-in sheets, smiling that thin, begrudging smile of his. He'd never liked Carrigan. Couldn't understand why someone with a university degree would want to be a policeman. Didn't like the fact that Carrigan hated sports, wouldn't drink the station's Nescafe, and rarely joined the others for after-work drinks down the pub. "We'll see when we break the door down, won't we?" Carrigan moved back as the two constables took hold of the ram. The door was old, had been painted over so many times it cracked in two like a rotten fingernail. The stench hit them immediately. "Jesus Christ!" One of the constables, Carrigan always forgot his name, pedalled back so quickly he ran right into Carrigan, his body warm and taut like a greyhound's. Carrigan stepped past him, taking a deep breath. His nostrils filled with a metallic sweetness, and he wished he was in the corridor again with the garlic and cabbage. Anything but this. It was a studio flat, small and self-contained. A narrow hallway, kitchen to the left and bathroom to the right. The bedroom-living room stretched out in front of them. At the far end, a small window opened out onto a rectangle of sun and trees. Carrigan focused on the leaves, golden brown already, as they swayed and trembled on the branches. Then he looked back towards the bed. Her arms were tied to the ends of the headboard. Her arms looked as if they had been stretched beyond their capacity, the skin tight against the bone. Translucent plastic ties snagged her wrists to the brass. He could smell the dark, heated mulch of blood, ammonia and sweat. He tried breathing through his mouth as he stepped closer. He could hear the constables cursing behind him, Carlson taking deep swallows of air, the clutter and clump of the soccos setting up their equipment. But they all seemed as far away as the detonation of trance music that was coming from an upstairs flat. He stared at the girl as flashbulbs popped and burst. Her body was sporadically revealed by the light, then disappeared back into darkness. Her nightdress had been cut down the middle so that it hung on either side of her torso like a pair of flimsy wings. The knife had gone deep into her chest, a dark red line running from navel to ribs. He stared at the wide canyon carved into her stomach, the dark brown shadows and glints of white poking from within. He felt last night's dream rise in his throat, and he swallowed hard to keep it down, taking short breaths, keeping his feet evenly spaced. He saw Jennings, one of his young DCs, catch a glimpse of the bed, then rush straight to the bathroom. Outside, he could hear doors being slammed, the shuffle of feet and ongoing lives, but in here there was only the stillness of death. He didn't want to look at her face, so he looked at her legs. It was almost worse. Small puncture wounds ran like bird tracks, crisscrossing her skin. He leant closer. Too small to have been made by a knife or blade, grouped in pairs. He moved back and saw that they continued up the torso and along the undersides of her arms. Small, pointed punctures, black with blood, evenly spaced, the flesh around them mottled, torn and weeping. They looked like animal bites, he thought with a shudder. Christ, what the... Carlson stared down at the open cavity of her chest, the perforation of her limbs, her cracked front tooth. Carrigan said nothing, headed for the window, took a deep breath as he watched the laundry flutter in the courtyard. He could see people going about their daily chores, oblivious and unconcerned. He turned back, finally ready to look at her face. He stood next to Carlson, smelling the man's sweat and fear, the reek covering his own. He tried not to look at her chest, the gaping hole, white shards of bone poking out like stalagmites, but the wound had its own terrible gravity. He heard Carlson curse under his breath and turn away. Behind him, a scene of crime officer was setting up his video camera, his colleagues drawing out strange containers of powder and unguent, miraculous dispatches from the frontiers of science. One man was unpeeling a roll of sticky tape, the horrible screaming sound filling the room as he cut it into strips in preparation to tape the body. A slow and painstaking job intended to capture any rogue hairs or fibres caught on the skin. The man looked up at Carrigan and shrugged. The soccos wanted them out. They had work to do, evidence to collect. They didn't even see the girl. She was only a surface from which information could be gathered, conclusions drawn. Carrigan bent down again, ignoring them. He put his mouth to the dead girl's ear. They heard him whisper something to her, but not what he said. They looked at each other uncomfortably. This was hard enough without the senior investigating officer talking to the dead, but Carlson and Jennings only shrugged. They'd learned to ignore the idiosyncrasies of their DI. Carrigan surveyed the girl's body once more, then leant back in and froze. "Carson, over here," he said in a dry, raspy voice. He stood over the body as the sergeant looked at the cavity in her chest. "What?" Carson said. "I can't see anything." "Exactly," Carrigan replied, pointing through the ribs at the empty space underneath. "It's not there." Carson stared at him confused, then looked back down at the body. "Her heart," Carrigan said. "It's gone." Chapter 3. This was it. Her last day. She could feel it in the way people walked past, avoiding eye contact. People she knew. It was like being made to wait outside the headmistress's office while everyone shuffled by, whispered to each other, glanced, giggled and went on about their business, while you sat suspended between your life as it was and whatever awaited you behind the door. She stared at the posters on the wall opposite her, trying to stop thinking about what was coming. Couched behind glass, they seemed like museum exhibits, not bulletins from the inner city. The slashed face of a teenager, the scar like a centipede crawling up his left cheek. Below him, locations where knives could be handed in. The eyes of a drink driver watching the stretchered bodies of his victims being taken away from the smouldering wreck. The appeal for vigilance on the tube. It wasn't working. She couldn't stop looking at the door to the super's office, waiting for it to crack open and unleash her fate. She stared down at her shoes, remembering she hadn't had time to polish them, thinking about last night, coming home after getting the super's request for this meeting, sitting down on the green cushion, opening a bottle, and then what? She woke up, fully clothed in her bed, half an hour to make the meeting. She didn't remember a thing. The bottle was almost empty, and her shoes looked terrible. It was acceptable for a man to come in looking dishevelled, but for a woman it could only count against you. The higher-ups hadn't yet managed to divorce the notion of sex from that of capability. She watched the clock, the slow spin of seconds accruing into minutes and hours. She ran her fingers through her hair, trying to untangle last night's knots. She wondered if he'd finally decided to press charges. How happy her mother would be at this turn of events. "Detective Constable Miller!" She jerked up and saw Superintendent Branch leaning out of his office, entirely filling the space left by the door, looking exasperated. She must have zoned out. Christ! Her smile was wasted. He'd already stepped back in by the time she realised he was calling her. She straightened her shirt and followed him in. This was her second time in his office this year. The last meeting hadn't gone well. He'd had a stack of files on his table, all with her name on them. He had detailed witness statements and DI reports. He said he had photographs. She'd looked through the window at the empty space left by the recently demolished church and wondered who had informed on her. "You hit a superior officer," Branch had said. "He was out of line, sir. He would have killed the boy," she'd countered breathlessly, unable to meet his eyes. "You blew your cover. You could have both been killed." "I couldn't let him do that, sir, even if it meant blowing the operation." "Yes." He sat back down, put one hand to his temple as if aware of a sudden pain there. "I've read your report. You should have waited until you were both alone. He was your commanding officer, for God's sake." Then he'd told her about the demotion. Detective Sergeant to Detective Constable. 5 years of hard work reversed just like that. She'd kept quiet, knowing any argument on her part would only increase their fears, make them even more wary of her. So she shut her mouth, nodded, and took her punishment. Now, sitting down in the same chair, staring at the same wall. She couldn't believe how stupid she'd been. Geneva. Branch was leaning back, his massive bulk making the chair look like it was about to collapse. His North Riding accent crunched down hard on the vowels, stretching them so that her name no longer sounded as if it belonged to her. You don't mind if I call you Geneva, do you, detective? She shuffled forward on the seat. It was too low, forcing her to arch her neck uncomfortably. She flashed back to being a girl again, sitting in class, the teachers looking down from their high perches, demanding an answer they knew you didn't have, the rest of the girls just waiting to burst out laughing. It's my name. Branch smiled and pointed to her shoulders. She looked down and saw that her earphones were still slung across her jacket and looped around her neck. She snatched them off, but they got caught and she flinched, feeling several strands rip. Her face was hot with blood, and she shoved them into her pocket. Sorry, sir. Branch nodded, eyes partly closed, as if assimilating some vital new piece of information. And, how have things been since your reinstatement? She knew it was a question, but also not a question. She wasn't sure what was expected of her. Humility? Gratitude? Resentment? It's a different pace. I'm getting used to it. I was a DS for 2 years. It's like going back to school. Branch smiled, leant forward in his chair so that she could smell the dark tang of stale cigar smoke on his breath. Very well put. I think we should all go back to school at some point. Good for the soul, you know. I spend a week every year out on the streets in uniform. Sometimes you climb so fast you forget what you leave behind. She nodded, but wasn't sure what point he was making. Branch was notorious for his gnomic non sequiturs. It was a clever technique, never quite pinning anything down, letting the other person join the dots, and if they screwed up, well, obviously they'd misinterpreted him. A woman's body was discovered this morning in King's Court, Queensway. Why was he telling her this? Did he expect her to know the case, only a few hours old, the other side of the Westway from her normal patch? She half nodded, let him interpret that, and scanned the table in front of her, the boxing gazettes and grey match programmes, the multitude of mobile phones lined up square and precise. This wasn't what she had expected. Waiting outside, she was certain this was going to be the beginning of the dismissal procedure, that he'd finally put in a formal complaint. She'd begun thinking of other jobs, what she would do, the naked horror of being flung back into the world. One of the phones rang, breaking the silence, but Branch didn't even glance down at it. This is one of those cases that has the potential of turning into a major fucking headache. He leant forward across the desk, and a stray bit of tobacco caught onto his blazer cuff and hung there like an ornament. She was African, a student. You remember the murder of the 2 French students a couple of years ago? Young, good-looking foreign students being tortured to death in their London flats is the last thing we fucking need on the front page of the Standard. We've got to keep this small and close. No press releases, no blazing blue light entrances. You understand? She didn't know where he was going with this, what it had to do with her. But at least he wasn't dipping into a file with her name scrawled in red on it, pulling out a form waiting only for her signature. It's D.I. Carrigan's case, you know him? I've heard of him, she replied neutrally. Branch nodded, his eyes glistening behind his round-framed glasses. He put his fists together in a gesture almost akin to praying, and she noticed the scuffed knuckles, bulbous and round like the skulls of midgets. Yes, I dare say most detectives working out of West London have. Something of an office legend, our Carrigan. Takes files home with him and studies them at night. cases that aren't his, thinks he'll work out what other men couldn't. You can see how that would not endear him to his peers," Branch darkly confided. "But if it was just that—" He pressed something on one of the phones and a red light started blinking. Geneva noticed that his fingers were scored with tiny white lines, as if they'd been tied up. He leant forward, his shadow stretching across the table towards her. "Frankly, Detective Miller, I'm worried about him being in charge of this case. I don't know how he got to the scene first, how he always manages to get to the scene first, but I would have been much happier if a DI with a little more discretion was in charge." Was he insinuating something? Geneva stared at Branch, trying to gauge the tenor of his comments, but either she was too hungover or she just wasn't good at reading faces. Instead, she flashed Branch her favourite smile, the smile she liked to give men in bars. It seemed to work. The super was momentarily flustered, resorting to shuffling papers and clearing his throat. "This is all between you and me. Not your DI, not your husband, understand?" Her skin flushed hot and itchy at the mention of Oliver. Her heart double-timed as she finally understood she wasn't here to be fired. "Carrigan's been getting sloppy. His cases have been overlapping and his reports don't make any sense. He keeps photos of all the murder victims he's investigated at his house. At first we humoured him, what with what happened and all. But recently he's been getting worse, more secretive. He's never been one of us, never wanted to. His main concern isn't going to be keeping this out of the press." "I thought our main concern was to catch the killer." It tumbled out before she could shut her mouth. She bit the insides of her cheeks until it hurt. "Yes, of course, but don't act so gauche, Detective. You know as well as I do that keeping this out of the public eye will greatly enhance our chances of catching whoever did this." He looked up at the wall, lost in silent thought. Photos of boxers lined the perimeter of the room, bloody and sweat-soaked, caught in a flash of action, their faces grimaced into scowls that made them look like dying dogs. Each of the photos had been signed and dedicated to Branch. "I'm going to second you to Carrigan's team as DS," he continued. "I want you to work closely with him on this." She wasn't sure she'd understood correctly, or that she liked what he seemed to be saying. "And report back to you, sir?" Branch smiled, his eyes crinkling behind the glasses. "Yes, exactly." He picked up a stack of files and evened the edges. "I'm glad you share my concerns." "You want me to spy on him?" She tried to keep the disappointment out of her voice. Branch shook his head as if she had misunderstood something incredibly basic. "Don't be so melodramatic, Miller. All I want is your report every week. No different from the report you'd hand your DI." He stopped shuffling papers and met her eyes. "I'm offering you a chance to get back to Detective Sergeant. On probation, of course." She looked out of the window, but the space created by the demolition of the church was now filled with a gleaming tower of mirrors. All she could see was their own building reflected in the shimmer. She turned away, focused on the still point of the super's table, breathing her nausea down. "Can I take a day or two to think about it?" Branch pursed his mouth, his lips smacking silently against each other. "I assume at some point you'd like to resume your former position permanently. I've read your file. There's no reason you shouldn't go as high as you want." She took a deep breath. Her chest ached and her head throbbed. this was one of those moments. Life before and life after. Except this time, it was in her hands, her choice. She wanted to say no, to stand up for what she believed in, but when she opened her mouth, the opposite came out. Branch frowned. I thought you'd be more pleased. I don't like the idea of spying on my direct superior. But you don't mind hitting them? A small smile curved the edge of Branch's top lip. He was out of line, sir. He did things he shouldn't do. Why do you think I chose you for this case, detective? She walked out into the blazing September sun, her eyes immediately squished inside their sockets, pulsing. She had left her sunglasses at home, Alka-Seltzer too. She took the earphones out of her pockets and set about untangling them, but her fingers were too clumsy, and she ended up putting them in lopsided and looped. She scrolled through the iPod's playlist, couldn't make her mind up, put it on shuffle. A scratchy guitar twanged and wailed in her left ear as she jumped onto the bus. She almost missed her stop. She spent the journey, neck craned, trying to see through the condensation and breath mist, but she only recognised the road after they'd passed it. She ran up to the bus driver, pleaded and cajoled until he let her out. She took a minute to find her bearings, the houses and streets all looking identical to her, then headed down the narrow tree-lined avenue towards her block of flats. She searched through her purse until she found the key that was more like some science fiction gadget than any key she'd previously used, slid it into the lock, and heard it click and tumble. At least locks still do that, she thought as she climbed the stairs to her flat. Her flat. She needed to get used to saying that, even though it was only a rental, and she'd probably move when the contract was up. The house would be put on the market when the divorce went through, and then she would use her share to buy somewhere else if the prices didn't go nuts in the interim. But that would take a while, and there had been no question of staying on at the house. They tried it for a couple of weeks, sleeping in separate rooms, but even that, seeing him every morning, hearing him every night, had been more than she could bear. She sat down on one of the large green cushions her sister had given her when she'd moved in. She hadn't had a chance to buy an armchair or sofa yet, kept meaning to do it, but was always busy. Just as she'd promised herself that this weekend she would unpack the boxes lying haphazard across the room like obstacles in a maze. All her life was contained in these boxes, her clothes, photos, books, memories. She wasn't sure if she wanted to open them yet, and besides, they doubled as tables and TV stands and places to throw all her work junk. In the fridge, she found half a pint of milk. She sniffed it and it seemed all right. She couldn't remember when she'd bought it. There was still some vodka left from last night, and enough Kahlua for a couple of drinks. She sat on the couch, savouring the rich smell rising from her glass, picked up the King's Court file, lit a cigarette, and was about to take her first sip when the landline rang. Yes? She put the glass down on one of the boxes and looked around for an ashtray. I am glad to hear you're alive. Her mother's voice always sounded more accented over the phone. She could never understand why. I've been busy. She looked down at her glass and cursed herself for picking up. She'd bought an answering machine with a screening feature to avoid just such ill-timed interruptions. I just got in, Mum. One phone call. That doesn't take much time, does it? Geneva bit down on her lip, flicked ash on the floor, and took a sip of her drink, not really tasting it at all. I'm sorry, Mum, she said, knowing this was the quickest way to end the conversation. What was so important then? I was seconded to a new investigation. A murder. You know how long I've been waiting for this. She couldn't suppress the hope and excitement in her voice, and it made her feel momentarily better putting it into words like this. She heard her mother exhale a long plume of breath on the other end of the line. "Murder. This is what gets you excited? Blood and suffering and all these horrible things. How do you ever expect to be happy when you spend your days dealing with the worst things that are on offer?" It was the conversation that skirted the edges of their relationship since she had taken the job, first year out of university. It was the reason she'd bought the answering machine. "I do it for the victims, Mum. You know that. You should be proud after what you went through, that someone wants justice." Her mother laughed, surprising her. "You have too much of your father in you. I wish it wasn't so, but it is. It made him disappointed all his life, and it'll do the same to you." She slammed down the phone, pleased it was an old corded model and still allowed this now antiquated gesture. She finished the rest of her drink, made another, and picked up the file Branch had handed her. She opened it up, flicked through the 3 scant photocopied pages, then took out the photos and stared at the ravaged body of the dead girl, feeling a strange quickening in her blood. Chapter 4. He was almost at the morgue when his phone rang. He checked the display. Superintendent Branch knew it could only be bad news. He stood outside the grey brick building overlooking the murky waters of the Paddington Canal and debated answering. Sharp drops of rain worked their way under his collar. He scanned the empty plaza, the fountain that didn't work, the shops yet to be leased, and put the phone back in his pocket. He didn't want to hear anything Branch had to say. The meeting this morning had been enough. He'd been working on the initial file, going through the preliminary crime scene descriptions and photos, starting up an incident log when Branch had called him in. Branch had spent the first 5 minutes edging the papers and photos on his desk while Carrigan ran through what they had so far. D.C. Jennings had got an ID from the porter's tenant book. Personal items inside the flat confirmed it. The murdered girl's name was Grace Okello, and she had listed her occupation as student. The constant rearranging and the concentration Branch gave it was making Carrigan irritable and jumpy. He resisted the urge to sweep everything off with a flick of his wrist. "I'm seconding a DS to come in and help you." Branch looked up from his organising, noted the expression on Carrigan's face and continued, "You're short on bodies and I want this wrapped up before anyone even knows it's happened. You know as well as I do what kind of case this could turn out to be." "I've done well enough with the team I've got." He hated the way his voice sounded when he talked to Branch, as if the super could bring out a younger version of Jack, a version he thought he'd left far behind. "We're always understaffed, we're used to it." Branch picked up a brown file, met Carrigan's gaze. "D.S. Miller will meet you at the morgue. Anything else, Detective Inspector?" Standing outside the morgue, waiting for D.S. Miller, watching the rain slough off the scaffolding and puddle at his feet, Carrigan knew that Branch no longer trusted him. It wasn't the past that mattered. It wasn't even the last case or the one before that. No, it was something personal. Something other cops, real cops, could always sense about him. A feeling of disengagement, not one of the boys, does things his own way, every cliché they could muster for someone from such a different background. Miller would be one of Branch's stooges, a watchful eye to hover over him. He stared at the new buildings going up, the skeleton frames of scaffolding poles stretched across the horizon, the grey spurt of the Westway rising like some Greek god from the huddle of flat roofs and satellite dishes. He remembered when this part of Paddington was wasteland, empty lockups and all-night cafes for taxi drivers. Now, Gleaming massifs of glasswork rose at every horizon, blocking out the sun. He binned his coffee cup, was about to go in alone, when he saw a young woman heading towards him, white iPod earphones dangling from her ears. He waited for her to shove a map in his face and ask him how to get to D.I. Carrigan, the woman asked, in an accent that could have come straight from a pre-war BBC radio play, all clipped vowels and Oxbridge Nights. He stood there, trying to make sense of this, as she offered her hand, small and perfectly formed. D.S. Miller, Superintendent Branch told me you'd be waiting. She was shouting, her voice rising above the background hum of rain and construction work. Carrigan pointed to his ears, then to hers. She looked bemused, then realised, and pulled out the earphones. They hung loose over her shoulders, like the straps of some invisible backpack. "Sorry, I was in such a hurry." "It's okay," he murmured, noticing how nervous she was, her hands and legs fidgeting the ground. "You can wait outside. You don't have to see this." D.S. Miller's face scrunched up, making her nose wrinkle, and he realised she wasn't as young as he'd first thought. "If I still had my phones on, I'd think I didn't hear you right." Her eyes met Carrigan's. They flashed blue, then muted. "Okay," he replied softly, "though it's not going to be pretty." "They teach you that at the cop school of clichés?" But this time she was smiling. Bentley, the pathologist, was expecting them. They followed her through the long white hallways and into a succession of smaller rooms. The older woman walked ahead of them, nodding to assistants, her speed belying her age. She looked as mummified and lifeless as the corpses she spent her days hunched over, but they were finding it hard to keep up as she led them down a set of dark stairs, the smell of mouldy brickwork and old wood exploding in their nostrils, and into a dazzling basement, tiled white and lit with savage intensity by strips of fluorescence criss-crossing the ceiling. "Which one?" Bentley said, as if she were a florist asking them to pick out a particular bouquet. The heat in the room was making Carrigan sweat, his nausea rising and ebbing in waves as the fluorescence winked and flashed like knowing eyes. All around them, white-suited orderlies were laying bodies on tables, prepping skin, washing instruments. He could hear the crunch of saw on bone, the whispered notes of other pathologists, the gurgle of blood sluicing down drains. He watched Miller closely. He had no idea what kind of police work she had done before, whether she had been handing out traffic tickets or investigating murders. She looked pale and sickly, a figure made somehow more insubstantial by the bright lights. There was also a faint smell of alcohol, but he couldn't be sure if it was coming from her or from the embalming fluids and disinfectants that permeated the walls. "Trust you to always pick the worst ones, Carrigan." The pathologist's voice was a strained smoker's whisper. "That's why I love you." Her fingers were dark yellow at the tips with nicotine stains, the skin like old leather or parchment, and what was left of her hair had been fashioned into a wavy Thatcher hairdo which was wilting visibly in the heat. When she reached for the handle, Carrigan tried to help her but was quickly shooed away. She pulled hard and the slab came rolling out, the wheels squeaking against the runners, the sound amplified by the tiled surroundings and the quiet which had descended on the two detectives. As the pathologist lifted the sheet to reveal Grace Okello's features, Carrigan saw Miller flinch, but he noted she didn't look away. He took his jacket off and wiped the sweat from his brow. "It's like bloody Rangoon in here, Bentley." "Air conditioning's broken. Went down this morning, but the electricians haven't shown up yet." Carrigan nodded, the heat, noise and smell welling inside him. "Been working on this one since early morning," she continued, peering down at the body of Grace Okello. "As I said, you always come up with the best ones. A lot of stuff to work on. Poor girl and all, but for us it's a bonus." "A bonus?" Miller asked, and Carrigan could hear the astonishment in her voice. She'd never dealt with a murder case, that much was obvious. He wondered why Branch had picked her. The sheet had been washed so many times the edges had turned translucent and shiny, revealing the skin beneath as if it were tracing paper. The silver instrument tray gleamed back the fluorescence-insistent highlights. This was the part he always hated, and yet it was also the best part. This was when the body started talking to you, when it was just you and them. He could have easily phoned the morgue, got all this without leaving his office, but it was his last chance to see Grace, the last chance to fix her in his mind, to remember why he was doing this. The pathologist slowly pulled back the sheet, making sure both sides were even. Miller's sharp inhalation filled the room like the sound of a punctured tyre. She looked as if she were about to faint. "I can do this if you want." Carrigan tried to get the right tone in his voice, a mixture of compassion and authority, but Miller just glared at him, eyes blazing.
"She took a long while to die."
Bentley's voice sounded scratchy and distracted. "Time of death?" The pathologist squinted.
"Can't say for certain yet. The heaters were turned up high in the flat, but sometime Sunday night, definitely. If I had to guess, I'd say between 9 and midnight, but I need to do more tests."
Carrigan shook his head and shrugged. He knew not to rely on the pathologist making everything simple and clear, as they did on television. She could only give him facts and numbers. How these related to a person, a death, a time and place, that was up to him and his detectives to find out. This part of any murder investigation was like reading the map before you set out on the journey. He saw Miller swallowing rapidly, her throat constricting and gulping as if she had swallowed something too big for her. She looked so ghostly, Carrigan thought, more so even than the dead body. Her eyes were scrunched in concentration, and her teeth were biting down on her lower lip, turning it white as a candle. He stared back down at Grace, the torn skin, the burst blood vessels in her eyes, the broken nails on her right hand, and when he looked back up, the room began to spin. It came out of his stomach with such force that he doubled over, vomiting all over the floor and Miller's overshoes. When he thought he was finished, his stomach spasmed again, a hot, burning pain in his throat as everything rushed out. His eyes lost focus, and he gripped the side of a nearby table, the metal cooling his skin. He used his hand to wipe his mouth and beard. Miller and the pathologist were staring at him. Bentley looked as if she were about to laugh, as if it was the funniest thing she had ever seen. But in Miller's eyes he saw something else, even though her complexion looked as green and pallid as his felt. Miller took a pack of hand wipes from her bag and handed him several. He felt her recoil in surprise as her fingers brushed the shiny scar tissue that ran up his arm from palm to elbow. He rubbed the wipes against his mouth, the rich, sharp smell of lemon making him feel instantly better. She palmed him a small tube of mints. "Thanks." He balled up the wipes, dropped them in the sanitary bin, and slid a mint into his mouth. A young African woman had come over and began mopping up the mess. She didn't acknowledge the pathologist, nor the two detectives, just silently carried on cleaning. Carrigan was about to apologise, but Miller already had her back to him and was staring at the body. "Can you construct a sequence of injuries from what you have?" Bentley looked at Miller and nodded, pointing to the dark mass of dreadlocks and pooled blood on the left side of the dead girl's face.
"She was hit with something relatively soft, a fist, I should think, several times. There's intracranial bleeding, which means it happened while she was still alive. She was also raped."
Carrigan leant forward, staring at the long gash running up the corpse's stomach, the bite marks and contusions, wondering why so much overkill.
"We found blue cloth fibres lodged between her teeth," continued the pathologist. "She was probably gagged during her ordeal. Cause of death, however, was this."
Carrigan watched as she delicately lifted the skin on the left side of Grace's torso. He swallowed hard as it revealed a mess of fat and tissue, the ribs white and jutting out at strange angles. Bentley put one gloved finger on a rib and pointed underneath.
"He cut her open, slit her from navel to clavicle with a very sharp, curved blade, then reached in and cut out her heart."
"She was still alive when he did this?" asked Miller. She thought back to her mother's words last night, tried to get that voice out of her head.
"I'm afraid so," said Bentley. "For a while, at least."
"He took the heart with him?" asked Carrigan.
"Yes, something of a romantic, our killer,"
the pathologist dryly replied, a weird twinkle in her eyes.
30 years, and I've never seen anything like this."
Carrigan stepped back from the body, the dazzling lights exploding in his eyes. He could hear Miller saying something, but he couldn't make out what it was. He looked up at the doctor, knew he had to ask, didn't want to. "What about the bites?"
"I was wondering when you'd get to that."
She pointed out the small circular bite marks on Grace's arms, thighs and face.
"I counted 69 separate bites, quite deep, most of them. And yes, before you ask, Detective,"
and this time her smile was wide and genuine, as if detailing some special talent of a favoured grandchild,
"the bites come from human teeth."
Miller leant forward and examined the small punctured semicircles, wondering what kind of man got his pleasure from taking something beautiful and turning it into ruin.
"Not just ordinary human teeth,"
the pathologist added, gesturing to one small bite mark along the inside of Grace's right thigh.
"Pointy teeth."
"Like a vampire bite." The old woman laughed, startling them both.
"We all know there's no such thing as vampires, Detective Carrigan. No, whoever did this has had his 2 front teeth filed to extremely sharp points."
She paused, as if to contemplate this.
"Perhaps even expressly for this purpose."
Chapter 5. She watched him from every part of the room. Her eyes stared lifeless across the vacant desks and empty chairs. Her limbs were mute against the gloss of the blazing lights, her wounds the only story left to tell. Carrigan adjusted one of the photos, stepped back and surveyed his work. Photos of Grace Okello were pinned to every available wall space of the incident room. Images taken at the scene and ones with white backgrounds from the morgue. Images repeated and juxtaposed. Images overlapping. Close-ups and long shots. Eyelashes and ripped flesh. Bedposts and kitchen appliances. The room laid bare, duplicated and blown up, each element gaining significance in its isolation. This was all his idea, the way he always did it from the very first murder he'd worked on back in 97, the little girl found behind the tube depot, until now. Every case began with a body, but that body was soon forgotten amidst the pathways and tunnels lit up from clues and background work. Policemen became seduced by logic, discrepancy, coincidence. 2 days into a murder investigation and they'd forgotten the victim, remembered only the MO, the errant boyfriend or estranged uncle. The photos made sure they wouldn't forget. They weren't here to make statistics. They weren't here to make a living. They were here to avenge the dead. This was his only certainty, the rock that had held him for so long to this strange and surprising career. The team filed in slow and stooped, looking like reluctant night shift workers, their feet dragging behind them, trying to delay the moment for as long as possible. They all knew how he worked, what awaited them in this room. He watched them shuffle to the mismatched desks, temporary solutions salvaged from some bankrupt school. He was proud of them, these moments making him realise he could never do this alone, and how they had forced him to accept this over the years. Carlson sat at a table to his right, fingers trailing through his stubble as he watched Carrigan. Next to him sat DC Jennings, DC Singh, and some of the younger constables. DC Berman, their internet whiz, sat, as always, in the back, his face half on Carrigan, half glued to the computer screens in front of him. While they organised themselves, found somewhere to look at that didn't have Grace staring back at them, Carrigan gazed out of the window, but saw only a greenish mist. Outside, the sun was sizzling low in the autumn sky, maybe one of the last days of pure sunshine before winter set in, but it didn't penetrate the green builder's mesh stretched taut and firm around the building's scaffolding like an oversized pair of tights. 3 months now they'd been covered in green. The station was undergoing major refurbishments, and Carrigan's murder incident team, as well as most of CID, had been moved to the new extension, promised that it would be the latest in office environments. Unfortunately, it was still in the process of completion, and they had to make do with what they could scavenge and hope the builders would be finished soon. The mesh cast a greenish glow on everything: their computer screens, the food they ate, their skin. He turned back to the room, saw them sitting, faces at strange angles, staring down at their notebooks. He pointed to the blown-up image of Grace Okello's face that he had pinned to the whiteboard directly behind him. His mouth still tasted sour from this morning at the morgue, his suit smelling faintly of sweat and vomit. Most of you already know that Grace Okello was discovered dead in her flat at 87 King's Court on Queensway at 10:34 yesterday morning. He looked down at his hands, trying to stifle the sensation in his throat, the sick memory taste of her blood in that small hot room, the pathologist's final revelation. Ms. Okello was brutally beaten, then tied down to her bed. The perpetrator raped her several times, secreting O-positive semen. It seems he bit her as he was doing this. He paused, watching the silent faces of his squad, the realisation in their eyes of what they were dealing with. When he was finished, he used a curved blade to open up her chest, then reached inside and extracted her heart. We can only presume he took it as a souvenir. Jennings and Berman were shaking their heads, trying to look anywhere but the walls. The photos had been bad enough, but now they knew the sequence of events that had produced this abstract display of horror and atrocity. It was much worse. The Sockos are just finishing up in the flat now, so we should get the preliminary results soon. The Holmes team are coming in this afternoon. Berman, I want you to go through the CCTV footage from the building's entrance. The porter handed over the tapes from the last 7 days. After that, they record over the old ones. He checked the camera on his way out. Trying to save money, the management of the building had installed only one CCTV camera at the front entrance. It recorded who came in and who went out, but gave no indication of whom they were visiting. I know it's a pain in the arse. I know we probably won't get anything from it, but we need to do it. Berman nodded, his fingers already tapping furiously at the keyboard. Jennings, run a list of the tenants against the PNC. Also talk to the porter. He was drunk, way beyond drunk, actually, when I approached him. Find out if he's a lush or he only got blotto that night. Check him out, too. Most of these porters have form of one kind or another. Talk to the neighbours. They won't be very cooperative, but push them. Someone must have seen or heard something. We tell them it's a murder inquiry? Jennings asked hesitantly. Carrigan shook his head. I know this makes our life harder, but not a word as to why we're asking about Grace. The super was very adamant about that. The papers find out about this, we're all fucked. Everyone laughed at Carrigan's rare lapse into profanity, the tension in the room dissipating for the briefest of increments. D.S. Miller and I will be looking at the victimology, trying to find out what we can about who Grace was, why anyone would want to do this to her. Carlson had his hand up. In the other, an unlit cigarette jumped like a child's toy.
She was a pretty girl. Isn't that enough?
Carrigan rubbed his temples. We don't want to start making too many assumptions yet, John. His words sounded forced to him. He knew they all had their theories, and that often it was those primary assumptions, based on nothing more than a feeling, which opened up a trail of clues that would eventually lead to the killer. On the surface, this does indeed look like a sex killing. He raped her brutally. The force of the injuries, the anger and personal nature of the attack, the fact he took a souvenir. What we have to ask ourselves is whether this is a one-off, perhaps someone known to Grace, or is this the first in a series? There were no marks of forced entry, so we have to assume that either Grace knew this person, or he got in under false pretences. The Sockos found 2 half-drunk glasses of milk in the kitchen. Hopefully we'll get the DNA results before the end of the next millennium. In the meantime, check all the usual utility companies, see if they report anything strange. Stolen uniforms, that sort of thing. I'll be looking at recent unsolveds to see if there's a similar signature.
Then you don't think this has anything to do with witchcraft?
Carrigan stared hard at Carlson, not sure if he was taking the piss or not. As usual, the sergeant was immaculately dressed and groomed, as if he had just stepped out of a glossy men's magazine. Why'd you say that? Carlson had been waiting for this, Carrigan could tell.
The mutilations, the missing heart, the fact she's African.
This isn't witchcraft. The voice had come from somewhere at the back. Carrigan scanned the room until he spotted Miller, hunched down into her table, taking notes, a can of Coke obscuring her face. He hadn't even noticed her come in, impressed at how well she had been able to conceal herself. Enlighten us, D.S. Miller. Carlson and one of the constables shared a joke, the kind of joke which has no words, only facial expressions and common prejudices. Geneva sat up in her chair, ignoring them, scanned her notes and took a sip of Coke, aware that everyone was watching her. First of all, there's almost no proven cases of African witchcraft in England, not on this scale. Amulets, herbs and potions on sale in markets, yes. Murder, no. It's too far-fetched, too small a possibility. Also, this is too messy. Too messy, D.S. Miller? Carrigan tried to keep his voice neutral, but it wasn't working. He could still remember his embarrassment in front of her at the morgue, his conversation with Branch that morning. Yes, she answered. In African ritual murder, the perpetrator kills so he can use body parts or blood for his magic. He wouldn't go for all this overkill. Certainly wouldn't have raped her, which I'm sure diminishes whatever power they think the body parts hold. Carrigan nodded to himself, having come to the same conclusion. Witchcraft and ritual were a fool's last handhold when everything else fell through. He knew that people mostly killed for petty reasons, to protect their position, to avenge an imagined slight, for money or for sex. What we should be concentrating on, Miller continued, finding her voice now, is why he did the things he didn't have to do. He didn't have to kill her at all. Jennings tried to make a joke of it, but no one laughed. Miller sighed. True, but not very useful. She checked to see if Carrigan was about to stop her, but he seemed lost in thought, staring out of the window into the green sky. He raped her and killed her. If we accept that this is a sex killing, then we have to ask why the overkill? Why not just rape her and strangle her?
The things he didn't need to do but did. The bites, the physical assault, the missing heart. We have to ask why he did those things specifically. What does it tell us about what kind of man this is? Did they have some symbolic value for him? Did something about Grace so enrage him that he felt he needed to kill her twice, 3 times?
Very well put, Carrigan interrupted. It bothers me too. Why beat her, bite her, and then extract her heart? A hush descended over the gathered detectives. Outside, the builders were laughing, joking, playing the radio. The music made Carrigan wince, even though it was only a faint flutter of notes barely audible. He thanked D.S. Miller, then pointed to the photos tacked up around the room. He waited until everyone had turned their heads and was staring at Grace Okello. Whoever did this, we need to catch quickly. This is the sort of thing you don't do on impulse. This kind of slow and deliberate murder, the perpetrator's been building up to it. Rape, assault. He'll probably have form, and even if this is his first time, he'll do it again. That's beyond doubt. This kind of thing doesn't happen in isolation. You don't rape, torture and kill a girl, then go back to your wife and kids and ordinary life. There is no life after this, but more of the same. He stopped, acutely aware he was going off into a rant again. I'm sorry for the shitty desks and the building site, but that's what we have. There'll be daily briefings here at 8:30 a.m. and 6:30 p.m. so that we can review where we are. He turned to the whiteboard. Remember these photos. We can't bring Grace Okello back, but maybe we can tell her we caught him, and maybe if we're lucky, she'll be listening. Chapter 6. He sat at his desk, an Everest of paperwork in front of him, a deep simmering in his blood, the phone lying silent. He'd pushed his other files to the side, the growing mountain of unsolved cases. Only the occasional phone call from a distraught relative to remind him they were still active. Each was accorded a separate coloured folder, and as he placed them to the side, he felt a spasm of guilt. He held the black file in his hands for a moment longer. This one was different. This one wouldn't go away. No one else reckoned its contents amounted to a crime, but Carrigan thought otherwise. He briefly flicked through the pages inside, the missing person reports, the detective summaries, the relative statements. There were 4 photos uncannily similar. 4 teenage boys, 3 reported missing and 1 found dead. No one else thought there was a connection. The cases were spread too far apart, up and down and across the country, several years between them. Boys that age often disappeared for their own reasons. Many were never found because they didn't want to be. But these 4, something about them, the way each boy looked like the others, black glasses, long brown hair, something in their gaze. He slipped the pages back inside and put the file to one side. The drinks machine was at the other end of the building, and he walked through empty corridors and the smell of fresh paint, then into the old part of the station. Immediately he felt the buzz of the busy squad room, the constant ringing of phones and voices of his colleagues, ears pressed against mobiles, fingers busily tapping keyboards. He nodded and said hello, checked the daily incident logs to see if there was anything that related to his case, then walked past more incident rooms filled with other detectives pursuing killers, drug dealers and internet fraudsters. The walls around him were covered in photos of valorous heroes injured or killed in the line of duty. And he walked past these somberly, as he always did, not wanting to see their faces and read the futures that would befall them in those eager poses. He waited for his drink to dispense and stared at the crime stat sheets lining the walls, the rotors crossed out and replaced by illegible scrawls, the reminders of best practice procedures. He returned to the incident room and sat back down in his chair, turning on all the lights to offset the gauzy green mist, took a sip of his drink and began going through the stacks of paper amassed on his desk. He'd faxed Grace's details, what little they knew, to all the London universities and colleges. The replies had come back quickly. Grace was enrolled at the School of Oriental and African Studies, studying East African history in the 3rd year of a 4-year course. He'd stared at the smudged fax and felt his heart beat a little faster. A coincidence, he told himself. That was all. He crushed the polystyrene cup in his hands and sent it flying towards the bin. Jennings had secured a list of all the tenants in the block from the management company. He'd fed it through the computer looking for hits, criminal records, complaints, the usual. Carrigan leafed through the printouts. He had an hour before he was supposed to meet Geneva outside SOAS to interview Grace's professor. He ran through the list floor by floor. Small-time drug offences, a few fraud cases, benefit dodgers, noise complaints. The names of the tenants were like a roll call at the UN. It seemed that every nationality was resident in King's Court, names that were too long for the forms, names with diacritics and letters not found on police-issue keyboards, names and more names. The case, he knew, would centre around Grace herself, who she was, what she did, her friends and acquaintances. He looked down at the page, the list of names, the floor below Grace's, then back up at the photos pinned to the walls of the incident room. Then he looked back down again, read the words twice to make sure his eyes weren't deceiving him. He couldn't believe Jennings hadn't picked up on it, then realised it was his fault. He'd only told the DC to print out the results, not go through them. It was there among the small-time crooks and weed pushers. It was there in black and white and in capitals. George Munro, flat 62. 3 years for sexual assault and battery. Released from the scrubs 2 years ago. Carrigan's fingers twitched. He stared down at the page, read sexual assault, wondering if Monroe had bumped into Grace in the lift or maybe downstairs in the lobby. Perhaps they said hello to each other, Monroe thinking there was more to it. If she knew him by sight, she might have opened the door for him, invited him in for a glass of milk. Carrigan felt a sharp electric flash spark through his fingers. He turned to the computer and typed in Monroe's name, but the mainframe was down and he was left staring at an infuriating egg timer telling him the system would be back online soon. He punched the keyboard in frustration, the R and Y flying out from under his fist, texted Geneva that he couldn't make the interview, grabbed his coat and paged Jennings. The rain had started as he left the building and was now coming down hard on the grey pavements of Queensway. Carrigan sipped his coffee, chewed on a Kit Kat and manoeuvred through the evening crowds. A shop that hadn't been there yesterday was already open for business, the city continually remaking itself. He walked past the souvenir stalls and kebab joints, the Russian supermarkets and money changers. Most of the signs made no concession to English. Even the alphabets were unrecognisable, a wondrous riot of crazy squiggles that could have been advertising anything. He surveyed the building's entrance from the other side of the road, scanning the faces, hoping to see something that didn't feel right. But there was only the rush and bustle of the crowd. Too many people. Too many eyes. Jennings was waiting by the front entrance of King's Court. Carrigan saw that he had 2 cups of McDonald's coffee in his hand and squirmed. The steam covered the constable's schoolboy face, wilting the lick of hair that rested on his forehead like an upside-down question mark. Carrigan thanked him, said he'd already drunk too much, and tossed the cup into the nearest bin. Jennings didn't seem to notice and kept fidgeting with his mobile. He was young, but one of the better constables assigned to him. Carrigan had seen a glint of something on the last case when Jennings had spent days going through useless computer records, a job no one else wanted, and then came back with the one piece of evidence that the jury would accept. Carrigan had learned not to judge the young DCs by their looks, his own advancing years making them seem that much more naive and callow. "I'm sorry I didn't go through the list," he apologised. Carrigan waved him off as they entered the building. "I didn't ask you to." "I know, sir, but I should have done it anyway." Carrigan nodded, kept walking, staring up at the CCTV camera, heading towards the porter's cubicle. "You won't find him in there, sir." Carrigan stopped and turned towards Jennings. "He's at the Rat and Firkin down the road, next door at McDonald's. I saw him going in there while I was getting this." He lifted the coffee he was still holding. "There'll be no point talking to him till he's sober." "We need to check his alibi," Carrigan stated flatly. "You think he was involved?" He could never get over Jennings's naivety. He knew the young DC would have it ironed out of him if he stayed another couple of years, but he liked it, the sense of genuine surprise at the world and its turnings. It reminded him of an old friend, but the memory was sour and filled his heart with pain. "No, I don't, but we need to check anyway." Jennings was smiling now. "Actually, I already did. When I saw him going in, I thought I'd have a word with the landlord. He was at the pub Sunday night, too. Apparently he's something of a fixture. I talked to the barman and 3 regulars, all alibied him for the whole night. Dead drunk, had to be helped home." Carrigan thought about this. "Good work." Jennings smiled. "I want you to wait in Grace's flat for me," Carrigan continued. "The Sockos are done, but I'm not. We need to go through her things. I've got a call to make on the next floor down. I want you to start making an inventory." Jennings' smile had frozen in place. "What is it?" Carrigan asked. Jennings shuffled his feet, hands deep in pockets. "I'd rather not go in there again." Carrigan remembered the look on the young DC's face when they had entered the flat and seen Grace's body, the way he had immediately rushed to the toilet and contaminated the crime scene. "She's gone," he said. "It's only her things there now." "OK." Jennings tried to smile. "I'd just rather—" "I know. So would I." The long corridors, drained of light, reminded Carrigan of mental hospitals, Victorian sanatoriums, places of deep darkness, demarcated by dimly lit hallways and locked doors. The stuttering lights added another level of gloom, the creaking and shuffling of floorboards, the buzzing of telephones and TV sets. He knocked once on George Monroe's door and waited. Monroe was taller than Carrigan, over 6'4", and almost as wide. He flinched when he saw the detective, quickly regaining his composure. "What is it this time, officer?" His voice sounded both weary and petulant at the same time, but his eyes told a different story. Carrigan pulled out his warrant card, but Monroe didn't even bother to look at it, just stepped back from the door. "Don't suppose I have a choice in the matter." Carrigan followed him into a flat that was almost a replica of Grace's. When these blocks had been built, there were only 3 apartments to a floor, 5 or 6 bedrooms to each. But in the last 70 years, the flats had been cannibalised and cut up into even smaller divisions, more money, less space. Leonardo said small rooms concentrated the mind, but he'd obviously never lived here. The room contained a TV, a DVD player, a coffee table, a bed, and an armchair. There was nothing else. No books, magazines, or decorations. It smelt of burnt toast, cigarettes, old beer, and bad breath. The TV was blaring loud, the voices cracking and distorting against the tinny speakers, accents from another century, the warm smell of the English countryside, fields and farmhouses and country roads. Carrigan's left ear began buzzing. "One of your favourites, The Railway Children?" Munro shrugged as he sank down into the deep armchair, the fabric almost encasing his body. "A classic," he replied, flicking the mute on the remote. "So, what is it I'm supposed to have done this time, Constable?" There was nowhere to sit but the bed. Carrigan stood by the small glass coffee table, staring at the layers of stains and discolorations, trying to work out what the original hue would have been. "It's Detective Inspector, and we're knocking on everyone's door, making inquiries." Munro nodded and continued to stare at the silent screen, his left foot nervously tapping the floor. The children were in a house, enshadowed by eaves, talking conspiratorially, their faces in close-up. "Where were you on Sunday night, Mr. Munro?" "What happened Sunday night?" "Answer the question." Carrigan hated interviewing ex-cons. They knew the tricks, knew how to goad the police, had spent all that time inside reading up about their rights. "Something happened Sunday night. You found my name in the register, which is why you're here hassling me." Munro was casually biting his nails, spitting half-moon shards of skin down onto the carpet. Carrigan looked down, the toes in his boots curling up involuntarily. "If a newspaper arrives at your door—" He looked up, but Munro's eyes were glued to the screen. "And the newspaper is in German, and you know the man 3 doors down once served in the Wehrmacht, then it's reasonable to assume—" "What the fuck are you talking about?" "I'm explaining why I'm here. I'm answering your question." He took out the photo, let it fall onto Munro's lap. "Do you recognise her?" Munro looked at Grace's photo for a long time, running his cracked fingers down the edges and nodding to himself. "She's dead." Carrigan's mouth went dry. "What did you say?" Munro met Carrigan's gaze for the first time. "Why else are you showing me a photo like this? Come on, she's either dead or missing. Otherwise a detective inspector wouldn't be wasting his time." He handed the photo back to Carrigan. "You still haven't answered my first question." They always thought they were cleverer than you, but it was their need to show it off that was also their weakness. "She lived here, right?" Munro nodded to himself, his eyes glued to the silent screen, the pull of the locomotive disappearing into the vanishing point of a grey horizon. "That's why you're asking. Who found out I'd been inside and—" Carrigan took 2 quick steps forward, leant down, and whispered in Munro's ear. "Tell me what you know about this woman now." He said it softly, but his grip on Munro's shoulder was firm and unrelenting. He could feel the man's muscles popping and flexing under his touch. "No. Never seen her. Wouldn't even notice her if I did. Can I go back to my film now?" Carrigan kept himself between the TV and Munro. "Where were you Sunday night?" Munro folded his hands in his lap. "I was at church." "Church?" Carrigan replied. Munro crossed one leg over the other. "Yes, church. What? You don't think people like me should be allowed into church? You don't think we deserve communion?" Munro shuffled forward on the armchair. Carrigan caught sight of something glinting white under the cushion. "Carrigan. That's Irish, right? Catholic?" "I don't belong to any church." "Yes, I can see that in your eyes. You're lost, and you don't even know it." Munro sat back, crossed his legs, and bit at his left thumb. "Anyone who can confirm that?" Carrigan tried to keep his voice low and steady. "The priest? Some of the regulars? It's St. Joseph's over the road. You can check." Carrigan made a note, though he knew exactly where it was. "Can you please get up, Mr. Munro?" "Are you arresting me? Stand the fuck up!"
Munro got up reluctantly, his face white and stretched, as Carrigan bent down and lifted the seat cushion. His stomach yawned against the constraints of his trousers, and he felt the blood drain from his head. Underneath the cushion was a square white photo album. Munro was staring anywhere but at the armchair. Carrigan could smell his fear now, the rank, meaty scent coming off the man in waves. He felt every muscle in his own body tense and sizzle as he picked up the photo album. "No, please," Munro mumbled, sitting back down as Carrigan opened the book and saw a 6-year-old boy modelling a pair of swimming trunks, the image ripped out of a catalogue. His breath stuck in his throat, and he could feel the pulse in his fingers as he turned the pages. Photos of young athletes torn from newspapers, Olympic swimmers glistening in dewy relief against blue swimming pools. More pages from catalogues. Young blonde boys playing board games, modelling T-shirts and underwear. Each page ripped out and then carefully neatened up, pasted into the book with little translucent butterflies. Carrigan cursed himself for running out half-cocked like this, knew he'd been slipping these last 2 years. His arms came down so quickly that even he was surprised. He picked up Munro and slammed him against the wall. The photo book fell to the floor. Munro's face crashed against a framed Elvis print, and his body buckled in Carrigan's grip.
"When did you last see her?"
Munro turned, his eyes misty and his lips split at the edges.
"She's not my type."
Blood poured down the side of his cheekbone.
"Get your facts right, Inspector."
He spat out some more blood. It landed on Carrigan's shoe.
"You show me this fucking picture. Ask me when was the last time I saw her. You fucking pricks. You don't even do your homework, do you?"
Munro's teeth glinted red.
"I don't like girls, Detective. Never have, never will. And I don't like anyone this old."
Carrigan felt the pulsing of the blood in his fingers, the heat of the flat, the whine in Munro's voice. He buried his fists in his pockets, felt them jumping inside. He stared at Munro, cursing himself. Munro pointed at the TV, 2 boys running together on a railway track, and emitted a high-pitched cackle. "That's right! Come to Daddy!" Carrigan shoved him hard against the wall, feeling a shock of electricity rip down his arm and through his chest. He saw Grace falling to the floor, blood trickling down her cheeks. He heard her scream. He let go of Munro and exited the flat, slamming the door behind him. Chapter 7. Geneva made her way through the press of bodies and up the stairs. Her stomach reeled and rolled, her palms clammy and hot. She stopped and took a deep breath of hazy London air, her vision going scrambly for a split second. She couldn't believe how nervous she was. Knew she was going to fuck it all up. She stared at the cool columns and smooth steps leading up to SOAS's main entrance, trying to focus on nothing, just the blankness in front of her, but it wasn't helping. Her first interview working a murder, and she felt like a schoolgirl about to be reprimanded. She'd been surprised when Carrigan had called an hour ago, told her to conduct the interview by herself. He'd sounded distracted and tense. She'd tried asking him what he was up to, but he'd hung up before she had even finished the sentence. It had been a while since she'd had a new DI, and she'd forgotten how hard it was. How it would take weeks, months sometimes, before you clicked, understood every unsaid thing. She didn't know what to make of him yet. He didn't dress like a policeman. He didn't look like one. A depressed lecturer in medieval history, perhaps, with his crumpled clothes and even more crumpled face, the hair that wouldn't sit still in the wind and his ridiculous fake barber interlaced with biscuit crumbs. He wore a wedding ring, but didn't look like a man who went home every night to a loving wife. She took a swig of her Coke, binned it, and entered the building. The hum of student life surrounded her, the frayed newsletters, wanted notes, mimeographed posters for bands with unpronounceable names, and political pamphlets, their covers stark with 20-point headlines in black capitals, so sure of their messages it made her heart shrink a little. A secretary guided her to a chair and paged Professor Cummings. His office was on the top floor of the building, encased by corridors and bookshelves. In front of her, a large window opened out onto the square below, and she watched the students gather, chat and slurp soft drinks in the late afternoon sun, their faces filled with exhaustion and wonder. She thought back to Norwich, her time at the University of East Anglia, the shadow of her mother far away, and the screaming, riotous nights of music and laughter that engulfed her fresher year. If only we could. She turned from the grease-smeared window and looked up at the man addressing her. Mid-40s, prematurely grey but dressed in a Grateful Dead shirt and sporting a ponytail. "Pardon?" "Go back." Professor Cummings smiled. "Change the past. Take the other turning, the one we never took. But we can't. Just as they..." He pointed out of the window, the nails on his hand long and curved like a guitar player's. "Just as they won't be able to go back to this day. You think they know this? Did we? Do you think it would make us enjoy each day more or less?" The professor's office looked as though it had been caught in the maw of a hurricane. She stepped inside and her feet scraped and jostled against the loose papers, photocopies and pamphlets spotting the floor. More piles of paper and spiral-bound dissertations leant and quivered in corner stacks. Cummings took his seat, apologised for the mess, but she could tell it was always like this. His T-shirt had blue clouds and yellow skulls against a purple background. His cargo pants were loose and hung asymmetrically, pens and who knows what else weighing down the side pockets. "Bloody smoking laws," he muttered as Geneva took out her voice recorder. "Used to be I could smoke in my own office, didn't harm anyone. Now I have to go down 10 floors and stand outside in the rain. You know how much valuable time I lose every day." Cummings let out a deep sigh, as if only now realising this wasn't another student sitting in front of him. No, of course, you don't want to know about that. She watched as he shuffled on the seat, making himself comfortable, slouching one leg over the armrest. "You said you wanted to see me in relation to Grace Okello, but you didn't say what she's done wrong, Detective." Geneva took out her notebook, flipped through the pages. "Why do you think she's done anything wrong?" she asked, looking directly into his eyes. "I get a call from the police asking to speak about Grace. What else would I think?" "I'm afraid Grace was killed on Sunday evening," Geneva stated flatly. Cummings dropped the pen he had been kneading between his fingers the last few minutes. He stared at Geneva, waiting for a smile, relaxation of facial muscles, any indicator that this was some elaborate practical joke. "She's dead." Geneva nodded, watching Cummings's eyes turn dark and hooded. He reached into the pocket of his cargo pants and extracted a pack of gitane. Without looking at Geneva, he took one out, tapped the end on the table several times to let the tobacco settle, and lit it with a lighter in the shape of a rhinoceros horn. "Jesus," he said, taking 3 deep drags in succession, as if he were a dying man sucking oxygen. He coughed into his hand, his eyes turning red and watery. "What happened?" he finally asked, the ash on his cigarette now longer than the unsmoked portion. Geneva stared at it, waiting for it to fall. She related the basic facts. Grace found dead in her flat. Said she couldn't go into details or theories, which was true, though she also wanted to see how much Cummings could fill in. "You were Grace's dissertation supervisor?" She looked down at her notes, though she knew the questions off by heart. Cummings took another drag and cleared his throat. "Yes. It was transferred to me when she proposed it. Anything East African gets parcelled out to me. He looked past Geneva to a point on the wall, a poster of a desert scene, camels trudging through a sea of sand. My accounts of Grace will inevitably be biased, so be forewarned. Geneva watched Cummings carefully as he told her about Grace Okello. When he began speaking, his face lost a couple of years and sleepless nights. Something in his eyes lit up, and she could tell that he'd be a favourite among students. He had a way of talking, imparting information that wasn't condescending and yet guided you along so that when you came to the conclusion, you thought you'd got there yourself. Grace was bright, articulate and funny. That was easy to see. But I don't think I really spoke to her alone until it came time for the students to hand in their dissertation proposals. You work here 10 years, as I've done. You see the same ideas and theories recycled every year, so when something new comes along, it leaps out at you. Grace was that kind of student. International students tend to be far less trouble than English ones. They understand what a privilege it is for them to be here studying, while their friends are facing hunger, war, and unemployment back home. They don't use their 3 years as an opportunity to get drunk, stoned, and laid every night. Geneva scribbled some notes in her pad, though the digital recorder was preserving every utterance of the conversation. She sometimes found that her notes were wildly divergent from the recordings. One was for facts, the other for feelings, hunches, suppositions. She was also aware of the effect it had. How people got nervous when the person opposite them was writing things they couldn't see. You mentioned her dissertation. What was it about? Cummings leant back in the chair. She was interested in rebel groups, revolutionaries. The thesis was a study of post-colonial African insurgencies and coups. You said it struck you as original? What made it so? Cummings took a few seconds to think, rubbing his hands through what was left of his hair and nodding to himself. Well, most of these students, most young people, are enamoured by men with guns who come bearded and filthy out of the bush after years of fighting and take control of the country. I bet 1 in 3 students still have posters of Che Guevara on their walls. Geneva smiled, thinking of the Che poster her mum had in the kitchen, the letter the Argentine doctor had written to her mother before he set off on his fateful Bolivian journey. Well, Grace saw beyond that. Cummings continued, more at ease now he was back in his area of expertise. She didn't think that Che and Mao were such heroes. She saw how African insurgencies, like all insurgencies, began with good intentions and ended in blood, torture and jail cells. How every rebel regime that came to power became the very thing they'd sworn to destroy. She was looking primarily at her homeland, Uganda, at Museveni, who grabbed the presidency 16 years ago after fighting as a bush guerrilla. She looked at Charles Taylor in Liberia and Laurent Nkunda in the Congo, Gaddafi, Mugabe and Mobutu, and she was very interested in Joseph Kony. Joseph Kony? Geneva was lost. History never her strong point, African history a total blur to her, like Conrad's white map. The papers like to call him Africa's most wanted man, though there's a new contender for that crown every day. He's a northern Ugandan who began a rebel offensive in the mid-80s against the government of Museveni. His soldiers are called the Lord's Resistance Army, LRA for short, and most of them are abducted children. He says he wants to bring the rule of the 10 Commandments to the region, but in 20 years he's achieved just the opposite. What was so original in Grace's work was her take on these rebel movements. She saw them not as some glamorous Marxist emancipation, but as men who were only interested in blood, money and power, but who had learned to disguise their motivations in ideology and charisma. You see, Grace understood rebel movements not as political forces, but as death cults. Geneva made illegible notes, acronyms and names, skipping by her like station signs through a train window. She knew she'd need to get a handle on some of this material later, and kicked herself for falling into the professor's soothing tones when she was supposed to be interrogating him. And how was her work going? She was having problems these last few months, Cummings admitted, looking down at the table. She kept coming to see me, tearing out her hair, wanting to give it all up.
What kind of problems?
She was a perfectionist. She kept criticising her own work much more than I ever did. She wanted it to be perfect, to take account of everything. She thought that if she had all the facts about a given subject, the answer would be bound to reveal itself. Geneva nodded, thinking back to her own time at university and to how similar Grace's ideas were to hers concerning police work. But it doesn't work that way, Cummings continued. We can never have all the facts. There's too much information and it's constantly changing. And even if in some way you could gather all the information, it wouldn't necessarily lead to an answer. I tried to explain to her that undergraduate work was about realising this, finding the limitations of your methodology. It's more about unlearning than learning. Grace had a hard time with this. To be honest, most of our international students do. They come to London expecting certainty and accuracy, and we tell them it's impossible, a chimera.
Did Grace have any arguments? Any falling outs?
She remembered her own days at university, the heady shuffle of people, late-night discussions fuelled by booze and slogans, the shouting and placard-waving. She watched as Cummings took a moment to think it over. Most students like to take a bite out of us, former colonisers, the white man, he replied without a hint of irony. Grace wanted to take modern African leaders, the modern African system, to task. She wasn't interested in colonialism or its after-effects.
Did that get her in trouble?
Occasionally. I remember one day at the refectory I was sitting at a table with Grace and some of her friends. They were having a debate. Well, no, it was an argument, really. One of her fellow African students harangued her for going after black men, said their job wasn't to attack their own, but the white man. It got quite heated for a while, until another friend calmed them down. But these are students, Miss Miller. They get heated over which brand of coffee the canteen uses. If there are too many black cleaners in the building, I'm not sure this has anything to do with what happened.
Everything has something to do with what happened, Professor. We just don't know it until we have all the details.
Cummings shook his head mournfully. You sound just like Grace, Detective. I'm sure the two of you would have got along very well.
Geneva ignored the comment, not sure whether it was intended as rebuke or compliment. Did she have a boyfriend?
Cummings laughed. I have no idea. They don't tell us these things. She was a very pretty and highly intelligent girl. I would think she had one, or maybe several, but you'd have to talk to her friends about that.
Cummings riffled through his notes again, but Geneva could see he wasn't really looking at them. His eyes clouded, as if some debate were raging inside. But something changed, right? Something happened. She was guessing, but she saw him flinch, then shake his head.
I don't know how relevant this is, but you say you want to know all the details.
He took a deep breath, as if making some kind of inner decision.
The last couple of terms, she had been slipping a bit. Grades down, a few essays not handed in on time. It happens to a lot of students. But I never thought it would happen to Grace.
Geneva felt a blast of heat rushing through her. When was this?
Cummings thought it over. When she came back from the Christmas break, there was something
different about her. Different how? She seemed less communicative, more fervent. I don't know. Maybe I'm just imagining it. It was probably nothing. A break-up with a boyfriend, the pressures of work. Did you ever meet her parents? No, we rarely do, even with domestic students. She hardly ever talked about Uganda or her childhood, not to me, anyhow. She was a member of the East African Association, but that's normal for students from her part of the world. Most of them stop going after a year. They start making friends because of shared interests and hobbies, rather than history and genealogy. Drugs? Geneva stared at the professor. What, Grace? I very much doubt it. She didn't even drink. As I said, she was a serious student. Until the start of this year. Cummings nodded. I can only tell you my impressions. I'm afraid they're probably not worth much at all to you, Detective. Geneva stood up and shoved the notebook back in her pocket. They've been of more use than you can imagine, Professor, she said, watching Cummings stare at the files on his desk. He looked smaller, encased in his chair, buttressed by paper, and despondent too, as if, now that the interview was over, his last link to Grace had been severed, and all that remained would be memories. She was reaching for the door when he spoke. I've just had a thought. I don't know if this has anything to do with anything, but Grace's friend, Cecilia... He tapped another cigarette on the table, sighing almost silently. Well, we were supposed to have a meeting yesterday to discuss her dissertation, but she never turned up. Chapter 8. Grace Okello had not been a hoarder. For someone who had spent 2 years in the same tiny flat, she had amassed very little. Carrigan flicked through the inventory, lining up words and phrases with the objects they described. He glanced up at a poster advertising safaris in Uganda. A bitter taste filled his mouth as he stared at the family of lions in the bottom left-hand corner. He could almost taste the jungle, that deep, wet, sour stench that was always present. People saw jungles and thought they were places of life, an uncontrollable spurt of growth, but he'd been there and knew that jungles were only about death. Murder was an every-minute occurrence. The ground was made of the rotten mulch of leaves and dead insects. The plants had sharp spikes and devious poisons. The animals spent all night either killing or hiding. He got up and crossed the room, still a little out of breath from his confrontation with Monroe. His hand was throbbing, the flesh swelling around his wedding ring. The ring was too tight against his finger, sized for a younger man, but he liked the constant pressure, the close proximity of the metal which never allowed him to forget. He stared at the bed, stripped of sheets and mattress, and thought about the nights Grace had slept on it, the lying awake nights, wondering about life, about boyfriends and grades and money. He turned to see Jennings staring at the wall. He followed the DC's eyes to a small circular pattern of dried blood. The specialists would tell them angles, height, trajectories, but there was no mistaking the stain for anything else. Blood was always blood, but it was also so much more. Blood was evidence of a life interrupted, and blood announced itself. The heart sent it crashing through the veins and arteries, and even when those were ripped or violated, the heart continued sending fine sprays of blood everywhere, on the wall, clothes, weapons, as if it were the body's last utterance, a final attempt to point from the grave and avenge its own death. I keep looking at it, Jennings mumbled. I can't stop. Carrigan put a hand on his shoulder, felt it buckle under him. How long had he left Jennings in the room by himself? I know, he replied. Blood's like that. It has a certain attraction.
Go talk to the porter. I'll meet you back at the station. Jennings blushed and thanked Carrigan. He took one last long look at the circle of blood as if hypnotised and walked out of the flat. When Carrigan was finished, he let himself out, locked the door and replaced the crime scene tape. Grace's possessions would be transferred to the incident room later tonight. He'd detail Miller to go through the reams of papers, the books and notes and graphs he'd found. It was pointless work, but it needed to be done, and there was something about his new DS that told him she would do a good job. The fact that it would also keep her out of his way was an added bonus. He knocked on the door next to 87, waited until a Japanese man peered out. He ran through his spiel, flashed Grace's photo, got bemused headshakes and polite rebuttals. Another door closed, nothing out of place or suspicious, another name ticked off. He'd already detailed some uniforms to do this, but he knew he wouldn't be totally satisfied unless he did it himself. He spent the next 2 hours in a repetition of knocking, asking, thanking, leaving. The tenants were on their way to late shifts or in the middle of changing a baby's nappy or doing the laundry, the washing up, the day's crossword. They scrunched up their faces at the interruption, glanced cursorily at the photo, shook their heads and went back to their lives. He passed through cramped flats smelling of disappointment and loss, through lives lived in small boxes piled atop each other, work and sleep the only two certainties. No one was interested in why the police were asking about this one girl. Branch had expressly forbidden them to mention that she had been murdered, knowing how soon this would leak to the press. But with only a photo, no one cared, no one thought twice about saying no. There was still a sanctity about murder. People who usually wouldn't say a word to the police offered up all kinds of evidence and rumour. No one cared if the girl next door was a prostitute or a drug dealer, but if she had been murdered, then they could be next. He reached the last flat on Grace's floor and pressed the buzzer. It was sticky with something, like most of the buzzers, and he wiped his hand on his trousers, thinking of the coffee and cheeseburger he was going to have when this was finished. Diet be damned. He could hear the buzzer ringing inside the flat, competing with the sound of relatives arguing, washing machines spinning, TVs blaring, and kids screaming. It didn't surprise him that most of the residents didn't welcome the knock on the door. Bayswater had always been a place for immigrants fleeing religious persecution, revolution, and dictatorship. They took the last of their savings and bought a one-bedroom flat, somewhere they could lock the door, not answer the bell. Huguenots in Paddington and Romanovs in Queensway. Now there was a new breed fleeing civil wars and uprisings across Africa and the Middle East. They lived lives of quiet solitude, sequestered in their flats, not really part of the city, occasionally meeting in émigré groups, rehashing old tales, their eyes always fixed on the door. He wondered if their lives were really better here. Safer, yes, but cut off from their own history and culture, they seemed to wither like plucked flowers. The door opened slowly, a centimetre at a time, and a middle-aged woman with straggly grey hair peered at him through the crack. "I'm not buying anything." He tried for his best smile. "Well, that's all right, I'm not selling anything." This seemed to throw her. She stood there looking him up and down, clucking to herself and shaking her head. "If I could take a minute of your time, please." He showed her his warrant card. "You hear about the noise?" she said, letting the door open a further few inches. Carrigan squeezed himself through. "I've been to the porter, but he's always drinking. He doesn't care about us tenants." She stood so close to Carrigan that he could feel the heat of her breath on his neck. "I'll make a note to speak to him," he said, looking around the room. There were photos of the last Shah of Iran on 3 of the 4 walls. The same photo, different frames, the glass polished and immaculate. The room was neat and ordered, so different from most of the flats he'd seen. Rugs covered the wooden floor, ornaments hung from the bookshelves and windows. Pictures of two boys, running on a beach, practicing football, play fighting with one another, were spread across the white mantelpiece. "Your sons," he said, attempting small talk, but when he saw the expression on the woman's face, he immediately regretted it. She looked at the photos as if seeing them anew, then shook her head. "Once upon a time," she replied, her English lilting and accented, but strangely beautiful. "They disappeared 10 years ago in Tehran." She stated this as if she was telling him which university they'd gone to, her voice resigned to whatever 10 years of not knowing eventually left you with. He thought of his best friend Ben and his 2 daughters, the constant grief and worry, nights spent up waiting for them to come back home, and he was glad he didn't have children. There was too much danger out in the world, and there was too much awareness of that danger. "I'm sorry," he said. The woman shrugged and offered him tea. He accepted, letting her gather herself together. She came back out of the kitchen with a large brass jug and 2 clear glasses. The tea looked like molten honey as she poured it from the jug, high above the glass, letting the liquid cool on its way down. It tasted both sweet and bitter in his mouth, and he felt the caffeine kick in instantly. He took out the photo and passed it to her. "Do you recognise this girl?" The woman looked at it, nodding to herself and taking a tiny sip of tea. "She lives down the corridor, yes. I saw her in the lift many times." "What has she done?" He looked over at the photo of the woman's kids, thought about the last 9 doors he'd knocked on. He was tired of playing Branch's game. They'd get nowhere if people thought they were after Grace for drugs or prostitution. She was murdered in her flat on Sunday night. The woman's head snapped up, and she dropped the photo onto the table as if it were infected. She put a hand to her mouth, but nothing came out. "We're trying to find out if anyone saw or heard anything." "She was a good girl." The question surprised Carrigan. He nodded. "From what we know, yes, she was." The woman picked up the photo again, nodding to herself as she stared into Grace's eyes. "Her boyfriend was the troublemaker." Carrigan felt the tingle at the edge of his fingers, tried to keep his voice steady. "Why do you say that, Mrs. Najafi? Gulshan Najafi." The woman put down the photo. "Always arguing, those 2. You could hear it all the way across here. The boyfriend, he liked to shout. The girl, not so much." "You heard these arguments?" Carrigan moved forward in his seat. So quickly he unsettled the tiny glass, sending tea spilling across the table. She picked up a cloth and started mopping up the spill. "Not the words. You can't make those out. But the shouting, yes. Arguing all the time." "How can you be sure it was her?" Mrs. Najafi clucked to herself as if the answer was obvious. "I stepped outside to tell them to be quiet. I saw this girl and the boyfriend. She always apologized. He just stared at me. Those eyes. I felt like I'd been..." She looked down at the folds of her dress. "What did he look like?" Carrigan's fingers were trying to keep up with the information, the squiggles and crossings in his notebook coming fast. "They all look the same to me. Young. Those eyes, like I said." Carrigan coughed, wrote something down. "Black? White? Black. How young?" "Maybe in his early 20s. It's hard to tell. He wore a dark suit. Always with the fancy suits, that one. I knew he was wrong. A man who does not know how to behave with a woman.
Carrigan's clothes were heavy with sweat. The room seemed to be superheated, the windows all sealed with what looked like cling film. When was the last time you saw him? She poured another glass of tea for Carrigan.
Sunday night. That's why I remembered when you said that.
He burned himself taking a long sip of the tea, kept his mouth closed and bit down on the pain. Tell me what you heard, Mrs. Najafi.
The usual shouting. I just turned the TV louder. Then the shouting seemed closer. I opened my door and that man, her boyfriend, was outside the girl's door, banging his fists against it. He was shouting her name, making threats. I closed the door before he could see me.
Did you hear what kind of threats?
He said she was a whore. Called her that several times. He demanded that she open the door.
Did she?
The woman shook her head. I would have heard.
What time was this? She bent down, picked up a TV guide and flicked through the pages.
About 6 in the evening. Come Dine With Me was on. I remember watching the first half, then the shouting started.
How long did it last?
He was out there for about 10 minutes. Then I heard the lift go. He shouted one last thing. This time he was closer to my door, so I heard every word. He said, "You will pay for tonight."
The sun was still out as Carrigan finished the last of his espresso, letting the thick liquid roll around his mouth before swallowing. It was almost perfect, bitter yet sweet, thick and full-bodied, the crema lasting till the last sip. He crunched down on a biscotti, sending crumbs scattering all over his jacket, promising himself the diet would start tomorrow. He wiped his mouth, checked his watch, and was about to enter St. Joseph's when he noticed something. Too much coffee? Maybe. A man was standing on the other side of the road staring at him. Carrigan was certain he'd seen him earlier outside King's Court. He blinked, and when he opened his eyes, the man was gone. The inside of St. Joseph's Church was a strange mixture of smells: incense, sweat, and detergent. There were 2 people kneeling at pews, mouthing silent prayers. The coffee felt good, rushing inside him, the last 2 hours all piling up to that last piece of information. Grace had a boyfriend. They fought often. He was heard banging on her door and making threats the night she was killed. The priest confirmed George Monroe's alibi. He was a thick-set Polish man in his late 60s, with a face that seemed to have marked every travail in his life. He sighed and coughed as Carrigan spoke to him, said that Monroe attended Mass almost every night, was one of the few regulars.
You don't ask where a man has come from when you know where he's going, he added.
Carrigan thanked him and took a seat. He felt the peace that always settled on him in a church, the deep quiet and vaulted ceilings, the hum of liturgy, the tight concentration of the congregation. He'd never worshipped as a child, his parents doing everything to pretend they were modern-day English progressives and not the newly arrived Irish immigrants they really were. He remembered the arguments, his mother always saying it would be good if he went, and then his father, the heavy brogue unaffected by his years abroad, browbeating her with words like superstition, magic, poppycock, explaining that this was why they'd left the old country, to get away from all this, and the violence and grief it brought. He sat in a pew near the back, going over the few leads they had, as people began wandering in for the evening mass. He saw women and men, kids dragging reluctantly from their arms, workers and schoolboys, a traffic warden and 2 younger girls in McDonald's outfits. The service was in Polish that night, the thick-set priest intoning strange conglomerations of consonants and vowels between racking coughs.
Everybody but Carrigan had their heads down, kneeling, totally immersed in the moment. He sat back and listened, not understanding a word, enjoying it all the more so because of that. The dark mystery of the liturgy, its meaning only revealed in timbre and resonance. He closed his eyes and waited for something to happen. Chapter 9. Carrigan had told her to take the evening off, come back fresh in the morning and go through Grace's belongings then. The last thing Geneva wanted was time off. She didn't want to go back to her flat, to her mother's messages on the answering machine, the empty fridge and stacked boxes crowding the floor. This was the perfect way to avoid her life. Grace crowded her thoughts like a song hurtling through her brain. She understood this was not going to be like other police work. This wasn't something you could leave at the station, forget for 12 or so hours, then pick up again. This would be everything until it was solved, and if it wasn't, well, she didn't want to think about that. She stuck her head into the incident room, the flickering fluorescence and glare of computer monitors making her squint. Carlson was on the phone, his face scrunched up in intense concentration as he ordered curries for the constables working through the night. She sidled past Berman, tried to catch his eye, but he was hunched into his wall of monitors, his fingers playing the keyboard with such speed and dexterity he could have been a concert pianist. "Singh, you free?" DC Singh was suddenly engrossed in her monitor when, a minute ago, she had been chatting with Jennings. She said something about following up certain leads, but when she saw the look on Geneva's face, she frowned, flicked her hair back, and got up. They walked down the long, empty corridor, out of the green gauze, and into the sudden sun-glare of the main building. It struck Geneva how peaceful the new extension was compared to the bustle of the main station. Public streaming in and out, faces racked with worry, uniforms crowding around the coffee machine, support officers standing around looking lost. The desk sergeant snorted when Geneva explained what she was here for, mumbled a room number, and went back to his copy of The Sun. "They don't like it that we're in the new wing," Singh said, as they surveyed Grace's belongings, smudged and tarried by fingerprint powder, stashed in 2 brown boxes with a long string of numbers printed on each. Geneva stared at the young constable, her raven-black hair and green eyes making her look a most unlikely candidate for the Met. Singh kept checking her watch and smiling to herself as if she'd just heard a piece of good news but was told to keep it secret. "You mean they don't like Carrigan?" DC Singh looked up, thought about it and nodded. "Never have. The uniforms. There's something about him just doesn't spell copper to them." They picked up the boxes. "And you?" Geneva said. "What's your opinion?" Singh brushed her hair behind her ear. "He's better than some I've worked with." Geneva noted the tact in the statement. "But..." They were now back in the new wing, and Singh's voice sounded unnaturally loud as it echoed through the empty corridor. "You know those dogs that hang on no matter what? You admire them, but at the same time you don't want to get anywhere near them." She gave Geneva a lopsided smile. "Frankly, they're all weird in one way or another. What being boss does to you, I guess." Singh kept smiling inanely. Geneva couldn't tell if it was because of what she'd said or something else, but it was starting to get to her, this constant jollity in the midst of what they were doing. They entered the incident room, now smelling of curry and milky tea. Geneva took one look, sniffed, and directed Singh to take the material to one of the smaller offices situated round the back. "You worked with Carrigan a long time?" Singh put down the box and straightened her blouse. "Nearly a year now. Why?" Geneva looked down at the table, avoiding the DC's eyes. "Just trying to get a sense of what I've come into." She stared at her hands, noticing the small red marks that had appeared overnight, a sure sign of stress, and wondered if her curiosity was because she really wanted to know, or because she had a report due for Branch. She scratched her red patch. Singh gave her a strange look, part sympathy, part something else. Geneva couldn't tell. "I'm sure you've heard the stories." Geneva had, some anyway, and what Branch had told her, couched in innuendo and knowing looks. "Enlighten me." Singh glanced at her watch. "You've seen the scar on his arm." Geneva nodded, opened the first box and started taking out Grace's belongings, carefully laying them on the table in front of her. "Got it on 7-7, Singh replied. "Apparently, he was one of the first officers down on the platforms. He was a DI out of Paddington Green at the time, opposite Edgware Road, when the bomb went off. A colleague of mine was working under him then, said as soon as they heard the bang, Carrigan was out of the office, not a word to anyone. Some PCs saw him disappear down into the station, but it was all smoke and noise, and no one knew what was happening yet." Despite herself, Geneva was fascinated. She stared down at Grace's belongings and tried to keep her face neutral and disinterested. "Disappeared for over 4 hours, Singh continued. "They thought they'd lost him, but, it was so crazy that day. No one knew what the hell we were supposed to do. Anyway, some 5 hours later, Carrigan comes out of the smoke and rubble. He's covered in soot, bleeding from a large gash in his arm, and he's got this small terrier in his hands." Geneva's head sprang up. "He saved a dog." Singh nodded, and then they both started laughing, hard and uncontrollably. The stress of the past 24 hours easing, if only for a moment. "Are you okay?" Singh added, gripping her sides, trying not to laugh any harder. "You can imagine the welcome he got at the station that evening. They called him the Dog Whisperer for about a year. You know what the lads are like." Geneva had stopped the pretence of looking through Grace's things, utterly enthralled by this unexpected glimpse into another side of Carrigan. Did he explain what he had been doing? Singh had just about managed to stop laughing. "No, wouldn't tell the chief what happened. But my colleague saw him when he came back from Edgware Road and said there was too much blood on him for it to be just his own or the dog's." She looked up, shook her head. "But the weirdest rumour I ever heard about him was that he used to be in some indie band." She checked her watch again as she placed the bundle of paper on the desk, a huge grin appearing on her face and then just as quickly disappearing. "What are you so happy about?" Geneva finally snapped, wishing she could take it back, surprised by the tone of her own voice. DC Singh looked down, hiding behind the thick curtain of her hair. "I'm meeting my fiancé for dinner," she replied hesitantly. "We're getting married next week. I'm so excited. I know I shouldn't be with this case and all, but I can't help it." She flashed her ring, the diamond cut small and fine against its setting. "You with someone?" Geneva shook her head. She didn't want to get into that right now, and looked down at the table, the circular stains of coffee cups and food smears, trying not to think about her own flat, the empty rooms and unmade bed, the messages stacking up on her machine. She felt bad for the ungenerous thoughts she had had about Singh. "So, what do we call you when you get married?" "Singh," the young woman laughed. "Lucky thing about being a Sikh, I guess. You don't have to change your name." Geneva smiled. "You better go." Singh shook her head. "It'll take you ages to go through this alone. I can text him." Geneva quietly placed her hand on Singh's. "It's fine," she said. "You shouldn't let work fuck up your personal life." DC Singh thanked her. "I hate doing this part," she said as she pulled on her jacket. "Don't let Grace become real," she warned. "It's much easier that way." Geneva nodded and watched as Singh, flushed and bright with love and the prospect of a late-evening rendezvous, left the room. Suddenly it was quiet. She was alone again, and the weight of the case slumped back down on her like something physical. And there was nothing left to do but sink into these objects, try to trace an outline of Grace from the things she had left behind. Preliminary reports from the constables, a photocopy of the pathologist's verdict, an inventory, and, next to her feet, 2 brown boxes containing anything from Grace Okello's flat deemed worthy of a second look. Tomorrow she needed to brief Carrigan on how far she'd got. Tomorrow she would need answers. But tonight she wasn't even sure which questions she was supposed to be asking. The Sockos had finished their walking of the room, the slow, painstaking, centimetre-by-centimetre trawl through fibres, fabrics, spills and invisible stains. Their report was due tomorrow. She would have to wait and see how much of himself the killer had left. What she had in front of her was 2 days' worth of quotidian police work. Routine calls and inquiries, hastily written reports at the end of a shift. Most policemen found this material boring, obdurate and opaque as flint, unlikely to give up its secrets. But she knew it was in here somewhere. The thing that elides your eye the first few times, catches it like a loose nail the 7th. She scanned and reread. She made notes in a fresh notebook, drew up timelines and lists of questions. She went through Carrigan's first-on-the-scene report, impressed by his concise use of language, so refreshing after the vague and rambling summaries of the uniforms. She scrutinised the text, forcing it to give up its meanings. This was what her mother had taught her to do. This was her childhood, squeezed into small rooms, always moving from one to the next, evenings next to her mother, scanning dense passages of modernist poetry. "You have to learn to read closely," she remembered her mother saying, and she, maybe 12 or 13 at the time, leaning forward, pressing her face up against the pages until her mother laughed. That carefree but shadowed laugh that could only have come from Eastern Europe. Saying, "No, dear, not like that." Her words both a kindness and a criticism. Evenings when she should have been watching stupid TV shows with her friends. Weekends she should have been out playing. The whole free time of her childhood presaged into tiny rooms, books with pages coming loose, the print old and degraded, thumbprints of previous readers left like discarded secrets at the edges. Read the sentence, and then read it again. Interrogate it. She could still hear her mother's accent, that curious Czech enunciation mixing with 30 years of North London. Ask it what it means. Don't go on to the next sentence until you've turned the last one inside out. A page of poetry should take hours to read. She picked up a report from D.C. Berman, who had gone through the building's CCTV tapes. He'd watched hours of footage from the day of the murder and 2 days before. Faces going in, backs going out, the diastolic rhythm of everyday life. Grace Okello entered her building at 5:24 on Sunday evening. She would be dead less than 6 hours later. Was there anything in her face as the camera caught its swift entrance that showed she knew? That evinced fear or apprehension, or even the excitement of waiting for a boyfriend to come over? Berman hadn't noted. He described what she wore, the time, and anyone who entered 5 minutes to either side of her. The problem was, they didn't know what they were looking for. No one yet knew what they were hunting. Berman had noted anyone who seemed suspicious, who looked up at the camera on entering or left in a hurry during the time frame of the murder. He'd printed off a few blurry stills, but the closer she looked, the more the images disintegrated into discrete dots, like one of those French Sunday picnic paintings at the National Gallery. She would have to watch the CCTV footage for herself.
The DC had done his job, but it was always worth doing it twice. The statement from the porter was equally thin and blurry. Jennings had noted that he was a long-term drunk, halfway into some savage bender, reeking of whiskey and almost incoherent. The porter said Grace seemed a quiet girl, sometimes brought friends round, but there were no complaints, and he'd never had to knock on her door and tell her to keep it down. He said most of the tenants were animals, and so the ones who kept quiet stuck out. She put the statement to one side, a steadily growing pile of leads she wanted to go through again, and moved on to the list of items found in Grace's flat. It was sad what constituted a life. Sad that when all else was gone, these pathetic remnants should sum up an entire span on this earth. Our belongings tie us to the world, but they remain after we're gone, mute witnesses. Things take on significance out of context. She knew this was why Carrigan had blown up the shots of Grace's wounds and pinned them to the wall. Repeat something often enough, and sometimes, eventually, a gravel of truth will slip out. She bent down and unpacked the next box, trying not to think about the boxes in her flat, and removed a stack of papers and books. Carrigan had asked her to take a cursory look at Grace's university stuff, the usual shaking out of pages and scanning for underlinings or torn diary entries hiding beneath the covers. She wasn't sure if he was sidelining her or not. This was a pointless task. The chances of finding anything among Grace's personal belongings were slim. She remembered Branch's comments that she had a report to hand in to him in 2 days' time. Her head began to ache. She unpacked the rest of the boxes. She took out books and photocopied sheets, graphs and maps. She spread them on the table, separated them into groups, and started with the books that had been on Grace's bookshelf. Books about torture and politics. Books about the psychology of pain and military interrogation manuals. A book on Nazi doctors, another on the Pinochet regime, one on Savak, the Shah of Iran's secret police force. Several books on Ugandan history, Idi Amin taking precedence. Other books on Equatorial Guinea and Libya, possibly samizdat, printed on cheap material, falling apart, the print fading, the books all buckled as if imitating the flow of water. There were no works of fiction, nothing for entertainment or leisure. There were Amnesty International reports, photocopied hastily and randomly collected in a binder. Graphs whose abstract delineations crazed her vision. She shook the books out, riffled through the pages looking for cryptic notes or hidden messages, but nothing more was revealed. She made a note to request the books for further perusal. Apart from books and clothes, there was little else. She ticked off all the things present on the landlord's inventory, noting nothing missing or cracked or broken. This left her with copies of The Guardian, The Economist, The Daily Monitor and East Africa Today, a handbag containing lipstick and powder, an Oyster card, a Ugandan passport, a packet of silk cut and a mobile phone. She made a note to requisition the Oyster card, surprised that the DCs had been so sloppy. If it was a registered card, she would be able to trace Grace's movements over the last few weeks from this one small piece of plastic. The mobile phone had been scanned and the address book copied and printed onto a sheet of paper. She stared at the names, some only initials, amazed at how few people were in Grace's list of contacts. Did she really have this few friends, or could she remember the important phone numbers in her head? She made a note to find out how long Grace had owned this phone and to see whether any of the call logs could be traced. There was nothing obvious in the names. No mum or dad or anything else signifying family. One of the DCs would have to spend a long morning glued to the phone. She unpacked the last box, the one she had been dreading. It contained all of Grace's dissertation work. There were hundreds of printouts from the internet, pages of hastily scrawled notes,
Photocopies of journal articles annotated and marked. She scanned through some of these, dense theoretical arguments for the use of violence, dense theoretical arguments against it. One sheaf, almost 100 pages long, seemed to consist of nothing but names and numbers, the names all African, the numbers seemingly random, as if picked from a lottery card. There were pages of graphs, economic analyses, the glyphs and scribbles like some arcane language she couldn't decipher. Over 20 or 30 badly printed pamphlets, Marxist rhetoric in bold caps and exclamation marks. Several were heavily underlined, the name Black-Throated Wind appearing in Gothic type on their covers. There was something about the phrase that made her quickly put the pamphlets to one side. She stared at the image emblazoned on their covers, a heart free of its body, suspended in space, dripping thin red strings of blood. Underneath was a stack of identical flyers for something called the African Action Committee. She remembered Cummings mentioning that Grace had joined an African society in her first year. Geneva looked down at the flyers, basic photoshopped headlines and a crossed-through silhouette of a black man carrying a machine gun. She scanned the tiny print, saw that the flyer was for a weekly Thursday night meeting in Hackney, and remembered Cummings saying that Grace had stopped going after her first year. Geneva took the flyer and put it to one side. She looked away from the table and out through the green mesh. London was darkening outside her window. She could hear buses and cars shuffling through the streets, the faint hum of a radio playing chart hits. She went back to her task, flicking through internet articles, pages from Wikipedia, the BBC News website, other news feeds. And then she realised. She looked up from the pages and stared at the objects on her desk, confused. She picked up the inventory and scanned it again, just in case she had missed it the first time round. She got on her knees and went through the boxes, unpacking the books and papers, making sure she hadn't overlooked it. She glanced back at the table. Grace was a student. Grace had printed all these pages out. So why hadn't they found a computer anywhere in Grace's flat? Chapter 10. The incident room, 6:30 p.m. Carrigan sat at his desk finishing off a packet of crisps. He rubbed his fingers on his cords and watched as Berman sat hunched over his computer screen, 3 other screens shielding him from the rest of the office, naked motherboards and strange boxes with wires surrounding his desk. Jennings was wolfing down a Big Mac, the smell instantly making Carrigan feel hungry again. Carlson was on the phone, his face shielded, his voice low, sweet-talking some new conquest, no doubt. Carrigan got up, saw that Geneva was late and Singh was missing, but started anyway. "How are we doing with forensics?" Jennings wiped his mouth and quickly scanned through some notes. "Still waiting for the DNA and other samples, but they managed to get a fingerprint off the glass of milk left in the kitchen. Same fingerprint they found on the plastic ties that were used on Grace." Jennings smiled like an eager schoolboy trying to please his favourite teacher. Carrigan could tell he was giving him the good news first. But... Jennings hunched his shoulders, his eyes straying from Carrigan's. "No hit on the PNC. Far as we can tell, the killer doesn't seem to have ever been arrested." "I was hoping we'd get something," Carrigan said. "Someone like this, it's hard to believe he's kept his nose clean."
"Maybe he's just better than we are," Carlson suggested. "The fact he's not on the database might only mean he's been too clever so far."
Carrigan looked up from his notes. Then why all of a sudden does he get so sloppy as to leave not 1 but 2 sets of fingerprints behind? Carlson's silence didn't make Carrigan feel any better. "Jennings, fax the prints over to immigration, see if he's on any of their databases." He thought of the man he'd seen outside King's Court not once but twice now. "Carlson,
Anything on SOAS? D.S. Carlson stopped jotting in his notepad, looked up.
Not much of interest. I spoke to some of her classmates. Got pretty much the same story from all of them.
Which was? Carrigan hated the way Carlson always teased everything out, the secret pleasure he got from it, as if it were the only thing that brightened his day.
Everyone I spoke to agreed that Grace was a model student, but none of them really seemed to know her. Studious, polite, but cold was the consensus. I asked about drugs, and everyone seemed very surprised we would ask that concerning Grace. I didn't get the sense that anyone was covering up for her.
Good, Carrigan replied. D.S. Miller should be here soon. She interviewed Grace's professor, so let's see what she has to say. He stared down at his notes, then back up at the room. He told them about questioning the tenants on Grace's floor. Gulshan Najafi's description of the row Grace had had with her boyfriend on the night of the murder. He heard low whistles and feet shuffling as the team assimilated this information. Did anyone mention anything about Grace having a boyfriend? Carlson shook his head.
I did ask, but no one seemed to know her outside of class.
Then we need to go back and re-interview them. The boyfriend is our main priority now.
Wouldn't you have been better used here than going round doing door-to-doors? It's a job for the uniforms.
There was a faint smile creeping across Carlson's face. Carrigan snapped his head round. The suit the sergeant was wearing was shiny and looked to have been shrink-fitted to his physique. Are you telling me how to run this investigation? Carlson smiled thinly.
No, just wondering if it was the best allocation of resources.
Carrigan felt his lips tight against his gums. He forced a smile. You wondering about how I'm running this case is a waste of resources. The door crashed open and Geneva came in, balancing a stack of papers and books in her hands. The tension in the room dissipated as everyone looked at her. Sorry I'm late, she said, dropping the bundle onto her desk, straightening her blouse and taking a seat. How did it go with the professor? She summed up what Cummings had said, more or less duplicating what Carlson found out from Grace's fellow students. Good work, Carrigan replied, remembering the old newspaper reporter's maxim that every piece of information needed at least 2 corroborative sources. And how did Cummings strike you? Geneva checked her notes. I think he likes playing the role of the cool hippie professor on campus a bit too much, but he was genuinely shocked when I told him she had been killed. I didn't get any sense that he was hiding anything, and his alibi checked out. She took a deep breath, not sure how to go about this, terrified here in this new team where everyone was looking at her, everyone immediately judging her. But she'd learned that keeping your mouth shut never endeared you to anyone, and besides, there were more important things than her career at stake. He talked about her dissertation a bit, and I had a look through some of her books and notes. She paused, taking in the mood around her. And, Carrigan said impatiently. Well, here goes, she thought, back to being a constable again. The Sockos didn't find a computer at Grace's flat, but all her notes, everything, was printed out. No one said anything. Carlson was giving her a strange look, but D.C. Berman's head had finally risen from his various screens. I think this is something we need to look at, Geneva continued. She was dealing with some pretty serious political stuff in her dissertation. I'd like to follow up on that. Carrigan looked at her, still trying to understand what her role was, why Branch had seconded her. It doesn't make sense, he finally replied. Why take her computer yet leave all her notes and books behind if it was about her work? They would have taken everything. Besides, the MO's too personal. We wouldn't be seeing such overkill if this was about her work. She probably just left it in her locker at SOAS. We need to concentrate our resources on finding the boyfriend. It's our only viable lead at this point, he continued. He was seen arguing with Grace a few hours before her death. It's much more likely that this is something that got out of hand than some conspiracy against her. Geneva stared down at her notes, surprised by Carrigan's rebuke. This was the first time she'd seen him like this, and she wondered if it was because of the case or something else. Had he worked out why Branch had put her on his team? We should at least check whether she had an internet connection. It won't take that much time. Sure. He shrugged his shoulders as a peace offering, but could see she wasn't accepting it, her lips pressing against one another like two thin pieces of wire. Jennings, I want you to keep hassling forensics. See if they can get that DNA sample analysed soon. Carlson, go back to the university, talk to her friends again. Someone must have seen her with a boyfriend or heard her mention one. You know how students talk. Carlson frowned and was about to say something but then changed his mind. Professor Cummings also mentioned a close friend, Geneva interrupted. Cecilia Odamo, another Ugandan. He said she hadn't showed up to an important meeting she had scheduled with him on Monday morning, and no one's seen her at SOAS since. Shit, Carrigan said, wondering if his words from yesterday were coming back to haunt him, if this really was the start of a series and not a one-off. Carrigan went back to his desk, the sound of the other detectives on headsets tapping away at keyboards, scratching down notes surrounding him. He picked up the phone and got the number for the Ugandan embassy. He got through on the first ring, a man with a rough-and-tumble accent answering breathlessly. Carrigan explained who he was and gave the man Grace's full name and passport number. Anything you can find about her parents, next of kin, would help us tremendously, he added. He could hear the young bureaucrat on the other end humming to himself and the distant hammering of fingers on a keyboard. Yes, the man returned to the line. We have here, OK, please wait a minute. Carrigan was put on hold. He cradled the receiver to his ear, watched Geneva throwing a pile of notes and papers onto the floor, then sat up when the voice came back on the other end of the line. Except this time it was a different voice, the man altogether older and with a much better command of English. D.I. Carrigan? Yes? I'm afraid we have nothing in our system concerning Miss Okello. The man's tone was smooth and urbane. But the person who answered the phone said he'd found... Thank you for your inquiry, Mr. Carrigan, but I'm afraid we can't help you. The man hung up the phone before Carrigan could ask him any more questions. He stared at the lifeless receiver in his hand, the buzz of work around him. A strange feeling crept up his spine, but he told himself it was nothing, just hearing that accent again. That was all. He slurped the remainder of his drink, his stomach reeling, feet jittering, the memories swirling and sluicing through his brain like wild things unloosed. The thought of going back home filled him with dread. He didn't want to stare at the walls, waiting for the day's adrenaline to wear off like some unexpected drug, and so, instead, he called Ben. They'd gone to university together, gone to Africa together, and now they met once a fortnight, discussed each other's lives, and watched old TV shows. They weren't scheduled to meet for another couple of weeks, the yearly trudge down to the Dorset village where David was buried, but Carrigan didn't want to go home tonight. His head still ringing with the day. Images of Grace flickering behind his eyes, the phone call to the Ugandan embassy fresh in his mind. He got off the train at Turnham Green, walked past the fields where the blood-soaked Civil War battle had been fought, past the church where Van Gogh had preached his mad, fiery sermons, and crossed the Great West Road. He turned into the narrow cobbled lane and walked through Chiswick Pier. It had been redeveloped during the last decade, erasing the park where he'd kissed his first girlfriend, the pub where he'd puked all over the landlord on his 18th birthday, the particular bend of the river he liked to sit by. They'd replaced them with faux Georgian condos and security gates. Each development had a quaint name, as if it was some isolated Cornish village. Stony Reach, Potter's Quay. Each condo had gates within gates, numbered finger pads, scrolling cameras, signs that warned private, keep out. A sense of an encased, preserved Britain, but one which was entirely fake. Ben's house was the first past the development, the old river residences butting up against the new. Jack unlatched the gate. Knowing this was the kind of life he could have had if he'd made the right choices, if things had turned out differently. He stared down at his shoes, noticing how the leather had torn and wilted from the tips, and pressed the buzzer. He brushed some crumbs from his jacket and beard. Dvorak rang out, faint and sickly sweet. Jack hoped it would be Ben who answered the door, but instead it was Ursula. Jack held his breath and met her eyes. Something flickered, then died like a match left too long in the wind. History flashed between them in that split second. 23 years reeling down the decades to when he first laid eyes on her in his lecture class, her long black hair cascading down her shoulders, the way she entered a room, the sound of her voice. They'd quickly become friends, discussing music theory, sharing cold drinks and warm chips. He'd been breathless the first time they spoke. All that term, he'd been waiting for the right moment, knowing it was the hardest thing to negotiate from being friends to something more, and how easy it was to end up losing both. She came from country house dinner parties and foggy Sunday morning hunts, beagles yapping at her ankles, a shotgun nestled in the crook of her arm. He came from Shepherd's Bush. He'd wanted her to meet his friends, not just another poor London Irish kid with dubious cohorts. It was obvious the first moment they locked eyes, her and Ben, and there was nothing Jack could do about it but step back and force his desire down to where it could be kept locked and bolted. And it had worked for a long time. It was only recently that he'd started thinking about Ursula in that way again. He knew it was more to do with nostalgia than lust. For all the span of his marriage to Louise, and those dark years after her death, he saw Ursula only as Ben's wife. But now something had changed, an imperceptible shift, the revoked past snapping at his heels every time he pressed the buzzer. "Good to see you, Jack." She smiled, holding the door open for him, her teeth white and perfect in that soft, mysterious mouth of hers. He nodded, saw her eyes drift down to his midriff, the overhanging belly and crumpled clothes, thought he detected a note of pity in her expression, and shuffled past her, through the elegant hallway bedecked with hunting scenes, and into the river room. Every time it got him. Every time he was taken aback by the sheer sense of space in the room, as it tapered into a wall made entirely out of glass, behind which the river glistened like molten metal. The afternoon sun sliced through and illuminated Ben, crouched in his favourite armchair, a pair of headphones clamped to his head. Jack stopped at the threshold, not quite ready yet. It was a place he knew as well as anywhere, and yet he'd never felt comfortable here. These days he preferred small rooms, dark garrets and subdivided office spaces, places where the world was contained without. Ben jerked up when he saw Jack, catching the headphone cord on the side of the chair, apologising and awkwardly extricating himself from the spaghetti tangle of leads.
"Hey."
Jack took off his jacket and sat in the chair opposite Ben. The fabric settled and moulded itself around him. Over the years, it had taken on his shape, changed as his body had, accommodating the middle-age spread around his waist, the years of too many coffees heavy with sugar. "I'm really glad you called." Ben's smile was the first thing everybody noticed about him. The gleaming white teeth, the way his eyes crinkled. It was the smile that had made him a regular on early evening TV, always in a white suit, his eyes blue as azure.
He'd started by making documentaries about civil war and genocide, and then a one-off special about the origins of man had led him to his own show, The Risen Beast, a mix of erudite anthropology and narrative history that had proved wildly popular.
Sorry if Ursula was a bit snappy.
Ben apologised while pouring the drinks.
She's pissed off at me. We were supposed to be seeing some friends of hers for an awfully tedious dinner party in bloody Greenwich of all places.
Ben laughed, and Jack remembered not just the smile and charm, but the laugh too. Even in their darkest moments, that laugh could be guaranteed to lift them. It was working now, and the day began to slough off with the first drink, like the rain trickling from the folds of his jacket. "But I can go if it's a bad time." Ben shrugged.
"Your phone call saved me. Don't you dare leave."
They both laughed. They settled down into patterns. They settled down into routine. Repetition comforted them in this room that hadn't changed over 10 years, belying the fact that they had. They fell into small talk, into catch-up and miscellaneous chatter, as old friends do, picking up conversations from last week, last year, a lifetime ago. Jack felt the whiskey diminishing the din of the day, the languorous rhythm of their conversation dragging him back into the world. "So you're off next week," Jack said. "Finally got your chance to teach at Berkeley." Ben's face gleamed.
"You know how long I've been waiting for this."
Carrigan smiled. "Good for you."
"How's your mum doing?"
Jack rubbed his head, saw real concern in his friend's eyes. "I was supposed to visit her today, but this fucking case... Last time I visited her, she didn't even recognise me. Kept shouting to the nurses that someone had broken into her room." He didn't need to say more. You reached a certain age and these conversations were always hovering in the air, a kind of heavy weather everyone ignored until it was too late.
"I'm sorry."
Ben set his glass down on the table, uncrossed his legs and leant forward.
"Are you sure you're okay?"
His wiry frame seemed to take in all the space around him, gangly arms and legs extruding at impossible angles, like some altarpiece Jesus.
"You look beat."
Jack took a deep breath and gave him a brief summary of the case.
"You telling me you want an easy one?"
Ben replied when Jack was finished.
"The husband who stabs his wife and sits there crying at the dinner table with the knife still in his hands when you guys show up type. Come on, Jack. You'd go out the wall if the case didn't have some nasty shit attached to it."
Carrigan conceded the point. It was always like this, as if Ben knew the things that Jack hid from himself. It's not that, it's not the blood, the senselessness, all the official departmental shit that goes with it. It's none of that. He drained his drink and put it down a little too heavily on the table. Ben winced.
"What, then?"
he asked, his voice a tad uncertain. Jack picked up the bottle and poured himself a half-glass measure, then took a large gulp. The whiskey burned going down, and it was a good feeling, pain well earned and deserved. "It's Africa." Ben was about to say something, but didn't. He took a sip of his drink instead and sat back on the chair.
"The girl,"
he finally said.
"The girl you were just telling me about was African, right?"
Jack nodded. "Ugandan." Ben's eyes widened.
"This can't be the first time Uganda's come up in a case?"
Jack shook his head. Too many to recount. Every one taking him back to that week 20 years ago when he and Ben and David were still young, their eyes blazing with the future they were going to write upon the world. He looked down into the dark swirl of his drink. More and more these days.
"So why does this one upset you so?"
Jack considered this. It was more a feeling, something he hadn't put into words, even in his own mind. "I dunno."
Maybe it's because it's the first Ugandan murder I've dealt with. It's... I don't know. The brutality of it. The sheer fucking waste. You're just getting older. Ben smiled, reaching for his glass. We both are. It's natural to get like this when you see it day to day. Ben was right, but he knew it wasn't as simple as that. She was writing her dissertation about Coney and the LRA. Ben let out a long whistle of air. And you think that's connected to her murder? No, Jack replied emphatically. But my new partner thinks it's something we should be looking into. Ben's smile softened his sun-creased features. Since when do you have a partner? Got foisted on me by upstairs. What's he like? Jack thought about Geneva, the way she seemed to be anywhere else but where she was, her wild hair and white earphones. Her name's Geneva, and she's good, surprisingly. Sharp and perceptive, more so than most of my regulars. He looked out at the grey sky, but I suspect Branch sent her to spy on me. Ben laughed. You're joking? Jack hunched his shoulders. He must be desperate if he's sending rookies. Trouble is, I don't know if she's working to some agenda Branch cooked up or not. He thought of the deep concentration in Geneva's eyes at the morgue, the trenchant questions she had asked. Pretty? Jack smiled. It's work, Ben. But the answer was clear across his face. Anyway, going back to the case, I'm pretty convinced it's a sex killing, he continued. Raped and tortured her. Classic predator stuff. The chances are pretty slim that this has got anything to do with Africa, with her politics or the dissertation she was writing. But the trouble is, I don't know what Geneva's motives are. Whether Branch is checking up on me, so I can't rule it out either. Of course, Jack Carrigan never rules anything out. Local police motto, isn't it? Jack managed to smile. Only thing is, I called the Ugandan embassy earlier, trying to see if they had information about Grace. The first guy I spoke to was friendly, and it sounded like he'd found something, but then someone else came on the line, spoke better English, so he must have been a superior, told me they had nothing, and hung up. You'd think they'd be happy to help us. Ben set his glass down. Don't worry, that's just how they are, as if secrecy was the natural order of things. You should have seen the bureaucracy and crap I've had to put up with when we're filming the show. And of course, over the phone you can't offer a sweetener. Carrigan reached down into his briefcase and pulled out a thick spiral-bound file. Inside was a copy of Grace's dissertation. I flicked through it. Didn't make any sense to me at all. He passed it across the table. You know this area better than me. I was hoping you'd have a quick look if you had the time. Tell me if there's anything worth chasing up. Ben took the file, flicked through it quickly, then laid it flat on the table. Of course. Jack took another sip of his drink. You ever think about it? It came out before he had a chance to stop himself. There was no need for him to explain what he meant by it. This was uncharted territory. This was everything they'd edged around for the last 10 years in these weekly get-togethers. This was the unspoken pact that allowed them to meet at all. We don't talk about those days. We don't talk about Africa. After they came back, they didn't speak at all. Not for years until Ben made the first move, calling Jack and inviting him to be his best man. Ben had never known about Jack's infatuation with Ursula. Jack had stood smiling as the happy couple kissed, and a few months after that they began meeting for drinks, and through 10 years of haze and life they managed to talk about everything else but Africa.
They slipped into their old routines and rhythms as if no time had passed, except, Jack thought, however much their relationship seemed to be the same, it wasn't. Africa, or Ursula, or the intervening years, he couldn't say which, had formed an invisible barrier between them, a thin line which they never crossed.
I think about it all the time, Ben said. No rebuke for bringing the subject up, no digression or equivocation. But mainly I think about him.
Ben's face drifted to the framed photograph of David sitting prominently at the head of his table. I try not to, Jack replied, avoiding the photo the way he always did. But that never works, does it? The atmosphere in the room had subtly changed, a silence almost waiting to be filled with words neither of them wanted to hear. A misty look at their memories' screened images from long ago. A burning laterite road, the stench of diesel and overheating engine oil, the perfume of palm fronds and cordite, the sound of breaking branches. I often wonder where I'd be now if we hadn't taken that trip. Jack continued, saying aloud for the first time the mantra that ran through his head every day on the way to the bus, brushing his teeth, staring up at the ceiling when sleep had escaped for another night.
You'd be a famous pop star, and I'd be just another overworked barrister.
Ben tried to make it into a joke, but they both knew it was as far from that as could possibly be. Jack looked past Ben at a photo of the girls, Susan and Penny. There were photos of them all over the house, as if Ben and Ursula needed constant reminders of what their lives were for. Even here in Ben's study, the bookcase was entirely given over to glossy shots drenched in sunshine and smiles. He thought of his own flat, the clean white walls, the single framed print. He had taken all the photos down 2 years ago. In a corner of the attic, there were 4 photo albums he couldn't bring himself to look at anymore. Each image of him and Louise now became a lie.
We made a decision, Ben finally said. What's the point of pretending we didn't? It shaped our lives, yes, but any other lives are inconceivable. If it wasn't that road, it would have been another.
He'd rarely seen Ben this emotional, but he knew how the past could come crashing up against the substrate of your consciousness like some unstoppable thing, and that once it did, everything was changed. You believe our lives are predestined? Ben lit a cigar, sucked in the smoke, rolling it around his mouth like a taste of fine wine.
I always thought you should have been a theologian, not a policeman, though I'm sure you'd say they were one and the same.
He held the cigar in front of him, watching the burning end flare in the darkened room.
But no, I don't believe that. I think we have choices, but the more choices we make, the less choices we have left. Our lives whittled down their own paths. Would other things have happened if we hadn't taken that trip? Yes. Would they have left us here? Well, that depends if you think personality is more forceful than circumstance. Maybe something else would have driven you to joining the Met. Or maybe you'd be playing Hammersmith Odeon this weekend. I don't think we can know. I don't think we can even guess. This God of yours that you so long to believe in, I'm not sure even he knows which way our actions will lead us. We are where we are and who we are. None of this is changeable.
Chapter 11. Geneva followed Carrigan across the street, through another narrow alley and into a covered market. She watched as he scanned the scene in front of them. She put her hand up against her face to shield the glare. brightly coloured stalls selling a multitude of phone cards to countries she didn't even know existed. Butcher shops with mysterious cuts hanging in their windows or dangling from hooks under the awning. The red explosion of flesh, white strings of fat, the marbled gloss of meat and halo of flies. The smell was different too, no longer the London she knew, but something more exotic, a certain allure in the strange scents and muffled yelling in garbled languages. But Carrigan just shook his head, and she followed him back into the high street. The long, unremitting row of boarded-up shops, and shops that looked boarded up but was in fact just the way they did business. She checked her watch, hoping he'd get the hint. They were already 15 minutes late for their meeting with Cecilia Ordamo. Geneva had got the girl's phone number from SOAS, called early and arranged an interview.
"Can't you just get coffee here?"
She pointed to an old greasy spoon, its windows fogged by steam, the badly scrawled menu almost unreadable. He snorted, as if that were answer enough, and before she could voice her concern, tell him this interview was more important than his damn coffee, he was off again, and she had little choice but to follow. She remembered what Superintendent Branch had said. His concerns, the complaints from both inside the Met and outside. She had never done anything like this before, worked both sides of the fence, and it left her feeling curiously enervated. She thought of her mother, how horrified she'd be, but her mother didn't know what it meant to be a female police officer. The extra hoops and ladders, so hard to find, so easy to fall back down. No, her mother wouldn't understand. But did she? As she followed Carrigan across another winding street, she wasn't sure she knew the answer anymore. And then she saw him stop, stand still, his head cocked towards a small, precariously leaning stall. A broad grin spread across his face, and it so softened his appearance that all at once she was ready to forgive him for all this stress and wasted time. Was it really worth the hassle? She asked, sipping the hot, thick liquid, refusing to admit that it was pretty damn good. Carrigan seemed to laugh, except he wasn't really laughing. "This is the best part of my day," he replied, staring at her as if trying to ascertain something. "These in-between moments. We've forgotten how to enjoy them. We pretend they don't matter when they do." He took another sip and continued. "I used to always wait for things to get better, tell myself I'd start enjoying life then. But things never really get better, they only get worse. So all we're left with are moments, fragments." He suddenly looked lost, as if searching for something just outside his field of vision. She hadn't expected this, nor the sudden passion that animated his face, and, for a brief moment, she saw the man he used to be, before all the bodies and blood. He finished his coffee and pulled out a sheaf of newspapers he'd bought at the station. She watched him scanning the Standard, the tabloids, rushing through the pages, his eyes concentrated as a laser guide. "Nothing yet." He looked up at her, the relief palpable in his voice. It had been 3 days, and the press hadn't got hold of the story. This was the crucial time. After a few days, the chances of them finding out were much smaller, and by now, with the body cold and stored in a morgue drawer, the story had lost its urgency. There were new things to report, new atrocities committed in the grey city streets, and for once, maybe they'd get to work this case as they should, and not with every latest edition second-guessing their investigation, notifying the killer, panicking the public. Carrigan took another sip, stirring the sugar carefully, watching it swirl and sink. She couldn't tell if he was thinking about the case or the coffee. She looked down the street at 2 women her age pushing brightly coloured pushchairs. They looked so happy and sunstruck. She turned back and said something, but Carrigan wasn't listening. He was staring intently at a young black man on the other side of the street.
"What is it?"
She moved closer to get a better view, but the man was already gone, disappearing into a crowd of shoppers. Carrigan stood there, his gaze fixed as a statue's.
"I saw him outside King's Court. Twice."
His voice was soft and shaded, as if worried someone would overhear. The man had looked normal to her, nothing to set her antennae twitching.
"You sure it's the same person?"
Carrigan stared across the street, but there were only families, traffic wardens, bin men.
"I think so," he replied.
Cecilia O'Damo's flat was in a basement off the Dalston Road. Once the area had been alive with rickety stalls, barrow boys and their unintelligible cries. Now it was another wasteland, stuck between two sets of yuppified ground, resistant to all attempts to clean up. But just 50 feet away from the main road, it was quiet, almost leafy, as if this side street existed in a completely different zone. They buzzed the ground floor flat. They heard shuffling, followed by the unlocking of several latches, heavy sliding weight and satisfying clicks. The door opened barely an inch. "Miss O'Damo?"
"I want to see some ID,"
was the first thing the girl behind the door said. They waited as she scrutinised their warrant cards.
"Did you come alone?"
It was a strange question, but they both nodded. The girl looked over their shoulder at the road behind them, then opened the door and let them into the flat. Carrigan took one last look at the street, but there was no one there. They stepped over piles of books and loose papers. They stepped over a tray of cat litter and last week's broadsheets. The flat hemmed them in, its low ceiling forcing Carrigan to stoop as he made his way across to the sofa.
"Tea?"
Cecilia asked, her voice shrill and taut like a bad note.
"Or coffee if you want. I've got instant."
Geneva watched with amusement as Carrigan politely refused.
"I'd love some tea,"
she said, knowing the girl needed the act of provision as a buffer against why they were here. The room took Geneva back 15 years, a student at East Anglia, first time away from home, her mother calling up every night to make sure she was okay. She stared at the walls, but there were no posters of cult films or pop stars, or even Shay or Marx. Just a single faded sampler depicting Jesus, a black Jesus with flowing dreadlocks and arms that were ready to embrace the whole of humanity, no matter what grievous acts they'd committed. Cecilia came back, 2 mugs of tea steaming in her hands, and balanced on top a plate of chocolate hobnobs. She looked older than Grace, though there were similarities between the two girls. The braided dreadlocks and ramrod posture, the razor-sharp cheekbones Geneva would have killed for.
"I'm very sorry about Grace,"
Carrigan said, with unusual warmth. Cecilia shuddered, the mug shaking in her hand. She opened her mouth, but nothing came out. She took another sip of tea.
"I just can't believe it,"
she finally said, her voice barely audible. Carrigan leant forward, his arms covering the table.
"You were close?"
he asked, his voice soft, his body unwound from its earlier tension. Geneva could see Cecilia starting to relax, to mirror Carrigan's pose, yet the girl kept averting her eyes to the window, as if expecting a late-arriving guest.
"I met her at Freshers' Week,"
Cecilia continued, her hand smoothing the creases in her jeans, smoothing them even though there weren't any.
"We were sharing one of the doubles in Chavez's house. I remember coming in on my first day, and there was Grace sitting cross-legged on the bed. Her suitcases were lying all around, and she was just sitting there smiling. I introduced myself and asked her if she was all right. She said yes, she just wanted to savour the moment. It was the first time she had been on her own, and she wanted to remember it.